Thanks for visiting. You're watching Fatal Files, and today I'm going to be showing you the dumbest tourists who gave it all up just for one photo. From the influencer who wedged himself between two moving forces for one perfect shot to a hiker in Zion who trusted his phone over a ranger standing right in front of him. It was July 22nd, 2017, at an outdoor music festival in rural western Wisconsin. The lawn in front of the stage was packed shoulder to shoulder under heavy humidity. Interlocked steel crowd control barricades formed the pit barrier as security moved through a narrow access lane, while pressure built near the front. Tyler McKenna, 24, stood 3 rows from the barricade. He worked at a shipping warehouse outside Minneapolis, but at concerts he had a different reputation, the one who forced his way forward when others stepped back, chasing the closest, most chaotic spot he could find. Tyler ran a small concert page where he posted pit videos and selfies from inside packed crowds. He liked angles other people avoided, standing on rails, climbing barriers, lifting himself above shoulder level to make it look like he was at the center of chaos. That night, he wanted something bigger, a shot from the exact middle of the pit with the entire surge behind him. The closer and more unstable it looked, the better it performed online. He had done similar climbs before and walked away without consequence. The lawn narrowed toward the stage, compressing bodies into a dense standing zone. The barricades were built to resist forward crowd pressure, not to support someone balancing on the crossbars. Rain earlier that evening had left the grass slick and the metal damp. By 9:15 p.m., the front section was packed tightly enough that lifting both arms freely was difficult. Security monitored the access lane for signs of distress. Several attendees later reported that breathing already felt strained near the barricade. At 9:18 p.m., the band called for a wall of death, and the crowd split into 2 compact lines facing each other. Security along the rail motioned for people to stay off the barricades, but the access lane was congested with staff monitoring distressed attendees near the front. Tyler moved forward anyway, phone mounted on a short grip. He stepped onto the wet mid-rail, 1 foot on the lower bar and 1 hand on the top rail, lifting the phone above his head to frame himself against the divided crowd just as the surge was about to collide. At 9:20 p.m., the music cut and both sides surged forward. The collision wave reached the barricade in under 2 seconds. Thousands of pounds of combined body weight drove inward, forcing the steel rail to flex several inches under the pressure. Tyler's foot slipped on the damp rail and his hand lost its grip. He fell backward off the barricade and landed flat on his back inside the densest part of the surge. People behind him were already moving forward. Witnesses reported seeing him fall and attempt to move before being overrun by the surge. Those in the next rows reported being pushed so hard they could not stop their steps. Multiple people stepped onto his chest and abdomen as a heel struck his face, and others landed across his ribs. The weight did not lift as the crowd rebounded and compressed again. Under repeated downward force, multiple ribs in the sternum fractured. The weight above him prevented his chest from expanding, restricting breathing and causing rapid internal chest trauma and internal bleeding. A pit spotter saw him go down and signaled for help. Security forced their way in from the access lane, pushing bodies aside to create space. It took several seconds to reach him. When they pulled him clear, he was limp and not breathing. CPR began immediately after extraction. Emergency medical personnel reached him within about 4 minutes of the initial call. Resuscitation efforts continued as he was moved out of the pit. He did not regain a pulse. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death traumatic compressive asphyxia due to a crowd surge. Sustained body weight crushed his chest, preventing him from breathing and causing fatal internal injuries. The manner of death was ruled accidental. After the incident, organizers increased pit monitoring and strictly enforced barricade climbing restrictions. Tyler's phone was recovered from the barricade area. Investigators confirmed he had been recording a selfie video at the moment he climbed the rail. The final frame showed his face above the divided crowd, captured seconds before the surge collided at the barricade. It was July 14, 2016, in a desert nature park outside Tucson, Arizona. The preserved stretch of Sonoran Desert was lined with marked walking trails weaving between towering saguaro cacti, some rising over 40 feet tall. Warning signs posted along the paths instructed visitors not to touch, lean on, or disturb the plants due to their fragile internal structure. Laureen Brower was 52 years old and worked as a bank teller in suburban Ohio. She traveled alone once a year and treated each trip as a personal showcase, documenting her visits heavily online and comparing her photos to other tourist posts. During past vacations, she had developed a habit of pushing past minor restrictions at viewpoints and challenging access limits when they interfered with the image she wanted. She had little interest in the desert itself and chose the park mainly because she believed she could recreate and improve photos she had seen online, aiming to position herself closer to the towering saguaros than most visitors were allowed. She arrived mid-morning, already irritated by the heat and long walking distances. Instead of stopping at the ranger station, she moved straight toward the trailhead, glancing briefly at the posted guidelines before turning away and continuing with her camera ready. Within 10 minutes, she stepped off the marked trail toward a dense cluster of saguaros. A couple walking behind her pointed toward a warning sign as she crossed into the restricted area. Laureen turned back, gestured sharply toward the trail in her camera, and lingered in a tense exchange before waving them off and continuing deeper into the open desert. The ground grew uneven beneath her feet, scattered with loose gravel and shallow roots pushing through dry soil as the trail disappeared behind her. She stopped at one of the larger cacti and set her camera on a nearby rock for a timed shot. The saguaro's trunk measured roughly 2 feet across, with a mid-height arm extending outward several feet above her head. Its surface appeared firm and intact, giving no visible sign of the internal damage hidden beneath. Another visitor called out from the trail and motioned toward the posted barriers. Laureen glanced back, made a brief dismissive motion, and repositioned herself closer to the cactus to adjust her angle. Saguaro arms often begin forming along the trunk more than 10 feet above the ground and can weigh well over 100 pounds due to water-dense tissue stored inside. Over time, bacterial necrosis can hollow the interior, weakening the structure while leaving the outer skin mostly unchanged. As Laureen reached up and pulled on the arm for balance, shifting her weight into it, the compromised joint failed. The arm broke free without warning and dropped heavily onto her upper back and neck, driving her forward into the gravel. She did not move after the impact. The couple on the trail witnessed the arm detach from about 15 feet away and rushed toward the trail entrance to alert park staff, while another visitor approached cautiously. Rangers reached the area roughly 20 minutes later and approached carefully due to the dense spines covering the detached arm before confirming she had suffered fatal cervical spine injuries along with severe blunt force trauma. The detached arm was documented before removal, and investigators determined she had knowingly left the marked trail, ignored multiple warnings from other visitors, and physically handled the cactus despite posted restrictions. The death was ruled accidental, with no negligence attributed to park management. The surrounding section of trail was temporarily closed while staff inspected nearby saguaros for additional structural damage before reopening to the public. Laureen's camera was recovered at the scene, still containing photos she had taken earlier that morning. It was July 2, 2016, along the Bright Angel Trail inside the Grand Canyon. Early summer temperatures had already climbed well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, and the canyon walls trapped heat along the lower elevations. While the terrain looked clear from above, trails below the rim could quickly disappear once hikers left the maintained routes. Melissa Drisk, a 33-year-old traveler who worked in a creative field that allowed remote assignments, had arrived alone that morning after several weeks visiting parks across the Southwest. She frequently documented landscapes during her trips and had recently read about a viewpoint along the Tonto platform described in an online travel blog. The location appeared reachable from the Bright Angel Trail if a hiker followed a faint path branching away from the maintained route. Melissa carried a small backpack containing a camera, 2 granola bars, and roughly 1 liter of water, far less than what park warnings recommend for summer hikes inside the canyon. She also had no trail map, navigation device, or emergency communication equipment, despite warning signs at the Bright Angel trailhead advising hikers to stay on marked routes and carry multiple liters of water during extreme heat. The Bright Angel Trail descended steadily through exposed rock formations and sparse vegetation. By late morning, Melissa had traveled several miles down the maintained trail. At a bend in the trail overlooking a broad desert shelf, she left the established route and followed a faint foot track leading east across the Tonto platform. At first, the path appeared clear enough to follow. The ground consisted of packed dust, scattered stones, and shallow washes carved by occasional rain. However, the track gradually faded as it crossed areas where wind and erosion erased footprints. Several similar-looking paths branched through low shrubs and rocky ridges. Without markers or prominent landmarks, the terrain became difficult to navigate. By early afternoon, temperatures across the exposed plateau exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground radiated heat, and shade was limited to small rock overhangs and short desert bushes. Evidence later documented through footprints suggested Melissa moved several miles across the plateau, attempting to relocate a recognizable trail. The terrain across the Tonto platform is uneven and broken by shallow ravines, forcing frequent detours. Investigators later concluded Melissa likely became disoriented as the faint tracks she followed gradually disappeared into similar terrain. At some point that afternoon, Melissa exhausted the water in her backpack. Footprint patterns discovered later suggested she continued moving intermittently between scattered patches of shade, occasionally stopping beneath rock ledges or shrubs. Over the next 2 days, temperatures inside the canyon remained above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. Without water, dehydration develops rapidly under those conditions. Tracks discovered during the search indicated shorter movement distances over time before eventually stopping near a dry wash surrounded by scattered rocks, roughly 4 miles from the nearest maintained trail. Melissa's vehicle remained parked near the Bright Angel trailhead overnight. When it remained there the following day without activity, park staff initiated a search of nearby trails. Search teams working the plateau located a sequence of footprints crossing the dusty terrain east of the Bright Angel corridor. Following those tracks eventually led them to Melissa's body beside the dry wash. Her backpack was found nearby containing the camera, empty water container, and uneaten granola bars. Investigators documented the absence of navigation equipment or additional water supplies. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was severe dehydration and heat exposure. Environmental records confirmed temperatures in that part of the canyon had remained above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the time she was missing. Investigators concluded the incident began when Melissa left the established trail and became lost across the unmarked terrain of the Tonto platform. With limited water and no navigation equipment, the extreme desert heat quickly turned a short off-trail detour into a fatal situation. Park officials later reminded visitors to remain on marked trails and carry adequate water when hiking inside the canyon. It was September 19, 2018. The sun was hitting the face of El Capitan just right, turning that massive chunk of granite into a glowing postcard. Down at the base, it was the usual scene. Tourists wandering around, some squinting through binoculars, others just acting like they're in a nature documentary. The air was dry and dead still, honestly kind of eerie in hindsight. Among the crowd was Luca Owen Drendel, a 50-year-old earth science teacher from Oregon. If you've ever had that one cool teacher who actually made geology interesting, that was Luca. He'd spent 20 years showing kids photos of this exact spot, teaching them about glacial erosion and rockfall mechanics. He wasn't some daredevil climber. He was just a guy who genuinely loved knowing how the planet worked. He'd finally made it to the real thing for his 25th anniversary, armed with a fancy camera and a lens big enough to see into the future. His wife, Renata, had made this trip happen after a rough year, a health scare, a few canceled plans. The whole life is short reality check. They were finally there, living the dream. They were walking the base trail, which, let's be honest, is basically walking under a giant, precariously balanced shelf of death. The Park Service has signs everywhere, and there was even an active advisory about rockfall. But have you ever met a tourist who actually reads the fine print on a map? Exactly. They'd been lingering for about 40 minutes. Now here's the thing about mountains. They talk, but we're usually too distracted to listen. People nearby heard some faint ticking and scraping coming from high up on the wall. A few hikers even heard a couple of loud cracks right before the main event, but they just shrugged it off, assuming it was a climber kicking loose a pebble. Then it happened. 1,800 feet up, a slab of granite weighing about 3 tons decided it was tired of hanging around. It broke off due to years of freezing, thawing, and pure thermal stress. By the time it hit the bottom, it wasn't one big piece. It was a high-speed shrapnel storm. Luca had his camera raised, tracking some climbers. When that sound started, he didn't freeze. He turned, shoved Renata backward, and protected her. It's a hero move, no doubt, but nature has zero appreciation for nobility. Renata took a hard fall, breaking her wrist and getting shredded by flying debris, but she was tucked behind a tree root that saved her life. Luca wasn't as lucky. A 40-pound rock found him. It was over before he even hit the dirt. When the rescuers arrived 11 minutes later, there was nothing to do. The autopsy report is grim. Blunt force trauma, instant death. The kind of thing that reminds you how heavy a rock really is when it's falling from a mile high. The park closed the trail for 4 days. A classic, closed the door after the horse's bolted move. They found his camera in the dirt, still holding those last few photos of the climb. It's a harsh, dark irony that a man who spent his life teaching the beauty of how rocks move ended up being taken out by a piece of his own curriculum. Makes you wonder, right? You spend years studying the world, only to have it decide to settle its own debt in the blink of an eye. Does this story make you rethink the risks of being a tourist? It was the 11th of July, 2016, in a basin up in the northwest corner of one of America's most famous parks. Steaming pools everywhere, some this insane turquoise blue, others this murky orange that honestly looks kind of alien. Wooden boardwalks wind through the whole thing, keeping everybody a few feet back from the water. It's beautiful, but it's also very clearly telling you don't touch. So let's talk about Christina. Christina Foster, 33 years old. See, Christina wasn't just another visitor taking pictures along the boardwalk. She used to actually work in mineral surveying. This was her world at one point before she switched careers. So when she's walking this boardwalk, she's not just looking at pretty colors, she's actually reading the ground, you know? She's got this little notebook with her, sketching out formations as she goes. This was personal to her. There's something kind of refreshing about seeing someone who's genuinely curious instead of just trying to get the perfect picture. We don't get a whole lot of that around here. And can we just talk about how insane these hot springs actually are for a second? The crust around them, the stuff that looks like solid ground, is sometimes only a few inches thick. Underneath it, you've got water that can hit almost 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is hot enough to cause fatal burns in seconds, not minutes, seconds. So far, Christina had been taking her time. She stopped at the warning signs. She read them. She even wrote a few things down. But further along, in this quieter stretch away from the crowds, she spots this cluster of mineral deposits just past the railing. And it looks fine. It looks solid, dry, totally normal. And you know what's interesting? It's usually not the person ignoring every warning who ends up making the mistake. Sometimes it's the person who genuinely believes they understand what they're looking at. She climbs over. She gets about 30 feet out, testing her footing the whole way, and it's holding. So she crouches down to get a closer look at the deposits, and that's when the ground under her knee just gives out. Witnesses down the boardwalk said they heard a short cracking sound, almost like ice breaking, right before she went in. And here's where it actually happens. She doesn't just dip a foot in. She goes forward hard, and both legs go under along with one arm, all the way up to the shoulder. The water at that depth is close to boiling. The moment her skin makes contact, it's not like putting your hand near a hot stove. It's immediate and it's total, the kind of heat that damages tissue on contact rather than building up over time. She's able to push herself back out within a few seconds, but a few seconds is already more than enough at that temperature. What follows is her trying to get herself back to the boardwalk while her body is going into shock. She makes it part of the way, crawling because she can't put weight on her legs anymore, before she collapses and can't move further. A family walking by, about 100 feet away, hears her and finds her on the ground. Cell service out there is garbage, so someone flags down another visitor who's got a satellite messenger. Even then, it's a 40-minute wait for rangers to reach her on foot, since the boardwalk sits well past where any service vehicle can get access. When they do get to her, the burns cover a significant portion of both legs and her arm, deep enough that she's airlifted straight to a burn center rather than a standard hospital. She hangs on for 2 days. But burns at that scale put an enormous strain on the whole body, not just the skin, and eventually that's what her system couldn't recover from. The ruling was straightforward. Cause of death was listed as complications from severe thermal burn injuries, manner of death accidental. The contributing factor was that thin mineral crust giving way under her weight in a spot that looked far more solid than it actually was. Her phone was recovered from her jacket pocket, and the last photo on it was a time-stamped shot of the mineral formation taken less than a minute before the fall. No further hazard mitigation was recommended since the crust in that section had never given way before. Some places can be studied for a lifetime and still surprise even the people who understand them the most. It was July 9, 2017, at Yaqui Point, where late afternoon sun lit flat sandstone slabs near the canyon rim. Loose gravel scattered across weathered rock as jagged boulders lined the edge. Tilda Pogue, a 26-year-old college student from Tempe, had arrived with 3 friends for an afternoon of sightseeing and photography. Known for her adventurous spirit and passion for parkour training, Tilda had spent the past 2 years developing her athletic skills at local gyms and outdoor locations. She was studying exercise science and often incorporated challenging physical movements into her recreational activities, viewing natural rock formations as opportunities to practice her techniques. The group had been exploring various viewpoints along the South Rim for several hours, with Tilda consistently seeking out interesting terrain features that could serve as parkour obstacles. The afternoon heat and hours of hiking had begun to take their toll, though Tilda's enthusiasm remained undiminished. At Yaqui Point, Tilda identified a flat sandstone slab that appeared perfect for practicing precision jumps. The rock formation measured approximately 8 feet in length and 4 feet in width, positioned several feet back from jagged sandstone boulders that marked the transition to the canyon's edge. The surface showed signs of natural weathering, with small cracks and loose gravel deposits. Her friends positioned themselves nearby with cameras, planning to document her demonstration. They noticed the loose gravel scattered across the slab surface and voiced concerns about slipping, but Tilda dismissed their warnings as overly cautious. They also pointed out her visible fatigue, suggesting she rest first, but she insisted on attempting the movement while the lighting remained optimal. She began with basic balance movements, testing the surface conditions. The rock appeared solid beneath her feet, giving no immediate indication of weakness. Encouraged by the initial stability, she decided to attempt a more challenging precision jump across the length of the formation. Tilda positioned herself at one end of the slab and prepared for a running approach that would carry her across the entire 8-foot length. She launched into the jump with considerable force, aiming to land precisely at the opposite end. As her right foot made contact with the landing zone, it struck a patch of loose gravel that had accumulated in a shallow depression. The small stones acted like ball bearings beneath her shoe, causing her foot to slide forward while her body's momentum continued in the original direction. The sudden loss of traction threw off her balance completely. Her left ankle twisted as she tried to compensate, while her upper body pitched forward. Unable to arrest her momentum, she stumbled across the remaining distance toward the jagged sandstone boulders just short of the canyon's rim. Tilda's head and torso struck the sharp rock edges with significant force. The impact caused a basilar skull fracture at the base of her cranium and catastrophic blunt force trauma to her chest and upper spine. The collision resulted in complete cervical spine transection at the C1 to C2 level, severing her spinal cord and making survival impossible. Her friends immediately called for emergency assistance. Rangers responded from the South Rim station, reaching Yaqui Point within 10 minutes. They found Tilda unresponsive among the rock formations, with obvious signs of severe head and spinal trauma. Despite immediate medical assessment and emergency protocols, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was determined to be basilar skull fracture and cervical spine transection with complete spinal cord severance. The subsequent investigation revealed that loose gravel on the rock surface had caused the victim to lose her footing during the parkour attempt. Rangers documented the unstable surface conditions and the positioning of the jagged boulders near the canyon's edge as contributing factors. The report noted that the victim showed signs of physical fatigue from hours of hiking in the afternoon heat, which may have impaired her reaction time. The official report cited the attempted parkour movement on an unstable sandstone slab, combined with accumulated fatigue, as the direct cause of the accident. It was November 9, 2015 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, after hours of heavy rain had flooded roads and forced widespread closures. GPS systems began rerouting drivers onto unfamiliar secondary roads, sending some into hillside neighborhoods of narrow alleys and steep passages, areas where invisible territorial boundaries were only understood by locals. Clara Vance was 24 years old. She worked at a small animal grooming shop back in Florida. The kind of job that keeps you busy, pays the basics, and leaves you dreaming about the next trip out. She traveled to Rio with two friends for a long tourist weekend, drawn by the energy of the city and everything she'd seen of it online. They rented a compact SUV to move freely between areas without depending on crowded buses or expensive rides. Clara was the kind of traveler who documented everything, phone out, window down, filming whatever caught her eye as the city moved past. Their navigation app rerouted them uphill after rain blocked their intended road. The alley the GPS pushed them into was narrow enough that the mirrors nearly cleared the walls on both sides. Graffiti marked the concrete in ways that meant something to people who lived there. Burned scooters sat at the edges of the road. Storefront shutters were damaged and pulled down. Residents sheltering beneath tarps along the alley saw the SUV and immediately began gesturing downhill, shouting for the vehicle to turn around. Inside the car, the group interpreted this as harassment, the kind of thing tourists are warned about in unfamiliar cities. They kept moving. Armed lookouts positioned roughly 50 yards farther uphill had already seen the SUV entering the alley. The vehicle was a compact SUV, the same general type used by unmarked units during police operations in the area. That resemblance, in a neighborhood with a long history of unannounced raids, changed everything about how those men interpreted what was coming toward them. One lookout reportedly called out that the vehicle matched the profile of a police SUV. The driver of the rental didn't notice the armed men stepping into the street until the SUV was already deep enough into the alley that reversing required a full turn in a space that barely allowed it. He began trying to turn around. The gunfire started before the vehicle completed the maneuver. Rounds came from farther uphill, and the windshield and side windows shattered within seconds. Clara was sitting in the rear passenger seat with her phone out, filming the alley through the open window, when rounds penetrated the rear door and window beside her. One struck her upper chest. The driver was hit in the shoulder and lost control, sending the SUV sideways into a concrete fruit stand along the alley wall. Market stalls collapsed as residents nearby ran for cover through doorways and up staircases. The vehicle horn jammed after the collision and continued sounding continuously. Additional gunmen farther up the alley briefly opened fire toward the stopped vehicle before the shooting gradually slowed. Witnesses stated the firing stopped once armed lookouts approached the wrecked SUV on foot and saw the passengers inside. Terrified civilians with no police equipment, no weapons, no radios, nothing that matched what they had assumed was coming up that alley. The shooters withdrew uphill through narrow staircases while residents moved toward the vehicle and pulled surviving passengers out onto the wet pavement. Clara had collapsed sideways against the damaged doorframe. She stopped responding before emergency crews could safely enter the neighborhood. I keep thinking about that moment when the residents were waving them back, shouting for them to turn around. What if they hadn't misjudged it? I can't help but wonder if our story would have ended differently. Emergency responders entered the area only after local negotiators secured temporary access. Police documented more than 24 bullet impacts across the exterior of the SUV. Investigators stated the GPS rerouting during the rainstorm was the primary factor that pushed the vehicle into the restricted neighborhood. Clara was pronounced dead shortly after responders removed her from the rear seat. The cause of death was confirmed as a gunshot wound to the upper chest. Local authorities questioned several residents in the area, but released limited public details, citing safety concerns. The rental SUV was removed downhill under police escort by tow truck the following day. Clara's case stays with me because the danger wasn't something you could see coming. It was invisible right up until the moment it was too late. It was August 22nd, 2022. A small group of tourists had joined a guided glacier hike in southern Iceland, one of the many excursions offered during the warmer months. The route crossed a wide stretch of ice broken by ridges, shallow meltwater channels, and narrow sections where the surface had shifted over time. Camille Laurent was 34 years old and worked as a pastry chef in Lyon, France. She was visiting Iceland on holiday and had booked the glacier hike as part of her trip. The tour did not require advanced climbing experience. The company provided helmets, crampons, harnesses, and ice axes, while trained guides selected the route and led the group across the glacier. So far, it had felt like any other organized tour. The hike began without issue. The group moved steadily across the lower ice, practicing their footing before continuing into rougher terrain. As they went farther out, the glacier became more uneven, with raised ridges and channels cut by running water. The guides adjusted their path several times, keeping the group spaced out as they approached a narrower section between a ridge of ice and a shallow meltwater channel. One at a time, the hikers were directed across. Several people made it through safely. Camille stepped onto the same section while the guide watched from ahead. As she reached the middle, a sharp crack spread through the ridge beside her. The guide immediately told her to move back. She turned to step away. The surface shifted beneath her. The first pieces of ice broke loose and struck the path, knocking her off balance. She fell onto the ice, and before she could get back up, a larger section of the ridge fractured and dropped across her lower body. The impact pinned her in place. More fragments slid down around her as the ridge continued breaking apart. Camille remained visible, partially trapped beneath the ice, unable to move her legs. The guides pulled the rest of the group back as debris continued falling, with several hikers slipping as they moved away from the collapse. One of the guides moved back toward her almost immediately, using an ice axe to break apart smaller pieces near her upper body. Another followed with a shovel, clearing what they could from the side. They were close enough to reach her, but the surface beneath them shifted again. A new crack opened above the same section, and more ice dropped into the area they had just cleared. Both guides stepped back as debris struck the ground around them. They tried again from a slightly different angle, working faster, pulling away loose sections and pushing ice aside by hand where they could. But just as they began making progress and exposing more space around her, the ridge shifted again. Another section broke loose and slid down across the same area, undoing what they had just cleared. The movement forced them back once more. At that point, what they were standing on was just as much of a problem as the collapse itself. Camille's position did not change. The weight across her lower body held her against the ice, and each shift in the ridge above sent more debris settling around her. One guide called for emergency assistance, while the other remained near the edge of the collapse, watching for any chance to move back in. The rest of the group stayed farther away on more stable ground, unable to assist without entering the same unstable area. The attempts continued in short bursts. Each time they moved in, they were forced back by fresh movement in the ridge. The distance between them and Camille never held for long. By the time additional rescuers reached the site and secured a safer approach, Camille had stopped responding. The effort shifted to removing the ice in a controlled way. She was later recovered from beneath the collapsed section. A post-mortem examination determined that she had died from severe crushing injuries. The remaining hikers were escorted off the glacier and treated for minor injuries and shock. Investigators later reviewed the route, recent temperatures, and the condition of the ice. They found that meltwater had weakened the ridge internally. From the surface, the crossing appeared stable, and others had passed through it only moments earlier. Camille Laurent died as a result of the collapse. Her death was ruled accidental. Honestly, this is one of those stories that makes you second-guess places you'd normally trust, like something that feels as solid as a glacier. It was September 18th, 2022, in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Visitors lined the roads watching wildlife in the open meadows, while rangers reminded them to keep a safe distance from the animals. Right in the middle of all those tourists was 40-year-old Caspian Moores. Caspian worked in real estate down in Colorado and had recently gotten really into travel photography. He wasn't some famous influencer, but he loved sharing his trips on social media. But over time, and I think a lot of us are guilty of this, he became hyper-focused on capturing that one image, the kind of shot that would stand out from the thousands of identical vacation photos people scroll past every single day. For his milestone 40th birthday, Caspian and his wife Melissa finally took that big Yellowstone trip they've been talking about for years. His friends always described him as outgoing, super competitive, and incredibly determined. To be honest, he was the type of guy who always pushed himself just a little bit further than he probably should have. This vacation was supposed to celebrate a big moment in his life. And me, personally, I get why he wanted something special. He wanted photos that felt grand enough to remember forever. On the third afternoon of their trip, traffic slowed to a crawl along a park road after visitors spotted a grizzly bear feeding out in a meadow several hundred feet away. Dozens of people gathered along the dirt shoulder to watch, most staying right by their vehicles while snapping pictures. Caspian joined right in and spent several minutes photographing the bear. But when he stopped to review the images on his phone, the bear just looked tiny and distant. And according to Melissa, Caspian wanted something way more dramatic. Personally, I think he was chasing that algorithm high. He wanted a photo that looked so close, it would make people instantly stop scrolling. Just then, a nearby ranger reminded the crowd to maintain the required distance from the bears, warning everyone that these animals can react unpredictably if they feel crowded. Caspian actually stepped back at first when the ranger walked by, but as soon as the ranger moved farther down the viewing area, he started walking right out into the meadow. Several tourists noticed and literally yelled at him to stop. One photographer even pointed out that people get mauled every single year because they get too close to the wildlife. But for some reason, Caspian just ignored them. The bear stayed focused on eating, and I think each successful step Caspian took just convinced him that the next one would be safe too. When Caspian finally stopped, he had moved far beyond the main viewing area and well inside the recommended safety zone. And then the bear suddenly lifted its head and looked directly at him. Melissa screamed for him to come back. Instead, Caspian raised his phone and started recording a video. The bear stood upright for just a second, then dropped to all fours and charged. Witness footage actually showed Caspian standing completely still for a moment. And to me, it looked like he was just confused rather than alarmed. His brain couldn't process the danger. The bear traveled the distance between them in seconds. So, by the time Caspian finally turned to run, the bear was already on him, slamming him violently into the grass. The attack unfolded in full view of dozens of horrified tourists. The bear bit into Caspian's upper body and neck, tossing him across the meadow before running off. Rangers and paramedics arrived within about 6 minutes. Responders found Caspian unconscious, with absolutely catastrophic injuries. When I looked at the medical details, it was just horrific, severe trauma to his head, neck, and chest caused massive, rapid blood loss. Despite emergency treatment right there on the grass, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Investigators later recovered his phone, and personally, I find it heartbreaking that his final images and video clearly documented his gradual, step-by-step approach toward the bear. The coroner's report concluded that Caspian died from multiple traumatic injuries caused by a grizzly bear attack. The damage to his vital organs and major arteries was just too severe for any human to survive. The park's official investigation determined that the bear was just behaving like a normal wild animal, and that Caspian had deliberately moved closer despite explicit warnings from park staff and everyday tourists. The bear was never hunted down because officials ruled it had simply reacted to a human approaching too closely. For me, this whole case is just a brutal reminder of why those wildlife safety rules exist. It was April 11, 2013, on Padang Beach in West Sumatra, Indonesia. The afternoon shoreline looked unusually exposed. Small fishing boats tilted on wet sand. Sirens echoed after a powerful offshore earthquake. Some people ran uphill toward concrete buildings. Others stayed and watched. Standing near the waterline was Arif Rahman, 26. He worked as a delivery driver for a bottled water distributor in Padang and helped his family manage a small roadside food stall on weekends. He had grown up along that same stretch of coast and often spoke about how well he understood the sea. Friends described him as confident to the point of stubbornness, someone who believed experience made him immune to danger. He frequently posted short videos of storms rolling in over the water, especially when the sky turned dramatic and crowds reacted. The more chaotic the scene looked, the more attention his posts seemed to get. When the earthquake sirens began sounding that afternoon, Arif did not run. Instead, he stayed to watch the shoreline change. The water had withdrawn dramatically, exposing reef and wet seabed. To him, it looked rare, something worth recording before everyone else cleared out. Police and volunteers shouted for people to move uphill. Most did. Arif stepped closer. Witnesses later said he appeared excited rather than alarmed. He raised his phone with the empty horizon behind him, positioning himself where the retreating sea made the widest backdrop. A vendor waved urgently and pointed toward higher ground. Arif stayed in place, adjusting his angle, choosing the shot over the warning signs unfolding in front of him. At approximately 4:35 p.m., witnesses described a dark line forming offshore. It rose quickly, not curling, but advancing as a thick wall of brown water. The sound shifted into a sustained roar that overwhelmed nearby voices. Several bystanders later stated that Arif only turned when others were already running. He was still within roughly 120 feet of the waterline. The surge reached shore in seconds. The leading edge struck him at chest height and knocked him backward. The water pushed inland with force, carrying driftwood, broken carts, bamboo poles, roofing tin, and metal fragments from beachfront stalls. Witnesses saw him tumble in the current. One fisherman reported seeing a wooden beam strike his upper body before he disappeared beneath the churning debris. The surge did not stop at the beach. It swept through low structures, overturning motorbikes and tearing apart food stands. Sand, timber, and scrap metal churned in the water. Several people who had not reached higher ground were pulled inland with the debris. When the water receded, sections of the shoreline were heavily damaged. Boats had been pushed against walls, several food stalls were overturned, and debris was scattered across nearby roads. Mud and seawater covered the lower portions of some beachfront structures. Arif did not reappear when the water pulled back. Witnesses told authorities they had last seen him near the waterline holding his phone before the surge hit. His family searched shelters and hospitals in the following days. His name was later added to the official list of missing persons. Search teams combed debris along the coastline for weeks, recovering several victims from wreckage scattered across the affected areas. Arif's body was never conclusively identified. Based on witness accounts and the conditions at the shoreline, officials concluded he was presumed dead due to tsunami impact and submersion during the initial surge. The event caused significant damage along portions of the beachfront. Evacuation routes were later expanded and additional warning signage was installed along coastal access points. Community drills were reinforced in the months that followed. Arif Rahman remained listed among those missing after the tsunami. Witness statements consistently placed him at the waterline with his phone raised as the surge approached. It was June 3, 2015, at a sandstone overlook in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey. Morning light stretched across the volcanic landscape as the first tourists began arriving at the ridge viewpoint. The viewing area stood roughly 200 feet above the valley floor, where centuries of wind and water had carved the soft volcanic rock into tall stone formations and cave dwellings. Martin Osei, a 34-year-old freelance photographer from Accra, Ghana, had been traveling solo across Turkey for 2 weeks, documenting landscapes for stock photo platforms. Friends back home knew him as methodical and detail-oriented, someone who researched locations thoroughly and planned shots carefully. That morning, he arrived at the overlook around 8:20 a.m., well before the main tourist crowds descended on the site. The official viewing area was marked by a low rope barrier positioned roughly 6 feet back from the ridge edge. The small warning sign near the barrier was primarily in Turkish, with limited English text. Beyond the rope, a narrow footpath worn into the rock showed where previous visitors had stepped past the boundary for better photo angles. What Martin couldn't see from the viewing area were the shallow cracks running parallel to the cliff face, roughly 2 feet from the outer edge. The previous week had brought unusually heavy rainfall to the region, the kind that saturates the soft volcanic rock and weakens the subsurface layers that hold the ridges together. Local guides later noted that no formal inspection of the overlook had been conducted following the rainfall. And here's what gets me about this case. Martin wasn't some reckless tourist taking selfies. This was a professional photographer who made his living capturing landscapes. He understood composition. He understood shot risk assessment. But sometimes even the most careful people can't account for invisible dangers. For 20 minutes, Martin photographed the valley from behind the barrier, capturing wide shots of the stone formations and cave churches carved into the distant cliffs. The morning light was perfect, but the rope limited his angles. At 8:44 a.m., he stepped past the barrier and positioned himself on the narrow ledge beyond the official boundary, seeking a wider perspective for his final shots. Two German tourists arriving at the overlook later told investigators they watched Martin standing motionless at the edge for less than a minute. He appeared focused on adjusting his camera settings while the morning breeze moved across the ridge. Then, without any audible warning, the ledge beneath his feet gave way. The outer section of the sandstone shelf, approximately 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, separated from the ridge in a single clean break. The fracture line followed the existing erosion cracks that had been invisible from above. Martin fell with the collapsed section, dropping 200 feet to the valley floor below. The German tourists reported hearing no outcry before the impact. Local emergency services reached the valley floor by 10:15 a.m., using a service road that wound through the lower elevations. Martin was found partially beneath the fallen sandstone blocks, his camera still hanging from its strap, shattered from the impact. The medical examiner later documented fatal crush injuries to the chest and head caused by the weight of the collapsed rock section. It was May 14, 2017, along the South Kaibab Trail inside Grand Canyon National Park in northern Arizona, where late spring temperatures had already begun climbing across the canyon and the exposed ridge trail received direct sunlight for most of the day as visitors moved steadily along the route, descending from the rim toward the scenic viewpoints carved into the canyon wall. Gray Ploft, a 29-year-old who worked rotating night shifts at a large storage facility, had stopped at the canyon during a road trip through Arizona with two friends. Gray had recently begun recording short travel clips during weekend drives and posting them online. Friends described him as energetic and impulsive, often eager to film quick adventure moments, frequently without considering basic safety precautions. The group arrived at the canyon after seeing photos of the South Kaibab Trail viewpoints circulating online earlier that week. Despite visible warning signs at the trailhead specifically advising proper hiking footwear, Gray stepped onto the trail wearing athletic shorts, a sleeveless shirt, and thin rubber flip-flops purchased at a gas station the previous night. The sandals had flexible foam soles and a narrow strap between the toes, the kind of footwear explicitly warned against in park brochures. Several hikers near the trail entrance noticed the footwear and commented casually as Gray passed, with at least two people directly mentioning that flip-flops were a poor choice for the rocky terrain. Gray dismissed the concerns with a wave. In one hand, he carried a small filming stick with a phone attached. In the other, he held a single 16-ounce bottle of water, far below what rangers typically recommend for hiking in the canyon. The group began descending the trail together, occasionally stopping where the canyon opened into wider views. About 0.8 of a mile down the trail, the path angled along a more exposed stretch where loose gravel had collected across the dusty surface. The narrow trail dropped quickly along the canyon wall, and in several places, the outer edge sloped toward steep talus fields that fell away toward lower ledges. As Gray walked, the thin foam soles of his flip-flops repeatedly bent against the uneven ground. Hikers behind him later reported seeing him adjust his balance several times while stepping over gravel patches, stumbling noticeably yet continuing downward without reconsidering his footwear. At one point, Gray turned around and began walking backward while holding the phone out in front of him to capture the canyon rising behind the trail, focusing on the phone screen rather than the trail beneath his feet. The path in that section tilted slightly toward the outer edge where small stones had accumulated. While stepping backward with his eyes fixed on the phone screen, the foam sole of his right flip-flop folded sideways under his foot. His heel slid off the sandal as his weight shifted onto loose gravel. Witnesses reported seeing his foot skid outward as the sandal twisted beneath him. Gray attempted to catch his balance, but his footing gave way near the edge of the trail, the flip-flop offering no grip on the unstable surface. His body slid off the narrow path and onto the steep slope beside it. The loose rocks immediately below shifted under his weight, and he began tumbling down the talus incline. Hikers nearby heard several impacts as he struck rock ledges during the fall. His body traveled roughly 40 to 60 feet before coming to rest on a rocky shelf between two outcroppings. People standing along the trail looked down and saw him lying motionless several ledges below. Two hikers moved up the trail to report the fall, while others remained at the edge to keep sight of his location. After hikers reported the fall at the trailhead, park rangers later arrived and carefully descended the slope toward the ledge where he had come to rest. When they reached the ledge, they confirmed Gray had suffered fatal blunt force trauma consistent with multiple impacts during the fall. Investigators examined the section of trail where witnesses reported the slip occurred. A broken flip-flop was found several feet above the edge along the gravel-covered portion of the path. The foam sole had bent sharply near the strap, consistent with the sandal folding under pressure. It was July 18, 2016. The temperature hit 94 degrees in the valley that afternoon. It was the kind of hot day in Yosemite where crowds pack every trail, all trying to get the perfect photo for their social media. The Merced River above Vernal Fall was doing its normal thing, moving fast and quiet over the granite rocks. Anna Claire Varelli was there, caught in the middle of that summer crowd. She was 24, a total brainiac in her second year of med school. She was the mom of her friend group. You know the type, carries a legit first aid kit in her bag, texts everyone when she lands, and is constantly stressed about her friend's safety. She was the last person you'd ever expect to do something reckless. But, as I've learned, nature doesn't give a damn how organized or smart you are. She was there with her friend Maddie and a few others. They rented an Airbnb and drove a borrowed car to get there. By the middle of the afternoon, they were worn out and very hot. They stopped at the Silver Apron, right above the waterfall. Now, everyone who went there has seen those signs. Park rangers plaster them everywhere, telling you not to wade in the river. It's not a suggestion, folks. It's a "you will die" warning. Anna Claire walked past at least 2 of those signs that morning. She probably thought a quick look wouldn't hurt. Honestly, I've been guilty of doing that kind of thing myself. The water looked like a calm, shallow pool. You can see why people get fooled. She told her friends she was just going to step in for a photo. Her friend actually told her not to do it. However, according to their testimonies, Anna ignored them. She stepped in. However, that solid granite was actually coated in a layer of invisible slimy algae. And as she put her foot down, the rock gave out, and she lost her footing immediately. Anna didn't fall gracefully. She slammed down hard on her hip. The current is like a conveyor belt to nowhere. It caught her instantly. Her friends tried to grab her arm and backpack, but the force of that water, it's like being dragged by a freight train. They couldn't hold on. Other hikers just watched, frozen, realizing that stepping in would just make it a group tragedy. Witnesses watched as Anna hit a ledge, rolled, and went over the edge of Vernal Fall. It is a nightmare to think about, especially since her friends watched the final seconds of her life. Search and rescue teams reached the area in 34 minutes, which is incredibly fast, but it was already too late. They found her the next morning. The autopsy report showed blunt trauma, broken ribs, and a fractured collarbone. The impact from the fall alone would have been fatal, even without the drowning. It is dark to say, but there is some mercy in knowing she likely felt nothing after that first hit. Afterward, the park issued a standard warning about waiting, but let's be honest, hardly anyone reads those signs. Her friends were left to deal with the aftermath. That final image of Anna didn't come from a phone that went over the falls with her. One of her friends had been taking photos from the bank just seconds before she stepped into the water, and the last shot in that burst shows Anna barefoot, moving toward the river with one hand slightly out for balance. And that frame ended up becoming the last image anyone had of her alive. It was the 15th of July, 2017, at a drive-through and walking wildlife park in Montana that houses several large animals in enclosures built to resemble their natural habitat. One section held grizzly bears, and the whole area was bordered by a low, wooden perimeter fence, only about 3 feet high, which honestly doesn't look like much when you're standing right next to it. Kevin Douglas was 44. Visiting the park with his family during a longer road trip through the state. He didn't have any real experience with wildlife beyond the usual zoo trips most people grow up with, and he'd been getting a little frustrated earlier in the day about how far back most of the viewing areas kept everyone from the animals. He wanted his kids to actually see something up close, not just distant shapes through a fence line. I don't have kids myself, but I get wanting to make the trip special for them. Then again, there's usually a pretty good reason they put the fence where they did. Grizzly bears at a place like this get a lot of space to roam, and a big part of their day is just lying around, especially in the heat, which makes them look completely still and harmless if you don't know what you're looking at. That stillness doesn't mean sedated, and it definitely doesn't mean slow. A grizzly at rest can be on its feet and covering serious ground within a couple of seconds if something triggers it, and it doesn't take much. See, this is why I'm perfectly happy with binoculars. There are signs posted along that perimeter fence stating clearly that the animals are not tame and that visitors need to stay behind the barrier at all times. Kevin's watching two bears lying in the sun, maybe 30 feet back from the fence, and he says to his family they look half asleep, practically harmless. His kids ask if they can get a closer look, and that's what does it. He climbs over the low fence, telling himself a few feet closer for a couple minutes isn't going to hurt anything. He gets about 15 feet into the enclosure when one of the two bears lifts its head and locks onto him directly. He stops walking, just stands there for a few seconds, and you can imagine that moment. The second he realizes the bear's actually paying attention to him now, not just resting anymore. The bear gets up onto its feet, and Kevin starts backing toward the fence. The bear closes that distance fast, way faster than anyone standing at the fence expected, covering what took Kevin over 10 seconds to walk in, maybe 2 or 3. Witnesses said it knocked him to the ground almost immediately and went straight for him, biting at his upper body and his arms as he tried to get back up. This wasn't one bite and done. It kept going for what witnesses described as several long seconds before park staff were able to intervene. By the time they pulled the animal off, Kevin had deep lacerations across his arms, his torso, and his neck. A park employee driving by in a maintenance vehicle nearby hears them and radios it in immediately. Staff get to the enclosure within about a minute, using deterrent tools to get the bear off him and away. A medical transport unit reaches the park within 15 minutes, but between the blood loss and the severity of the wounds, there wasn't much that could be done by the time help got to him. Kevin is pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death is ruled as traumatic injury from an animal attack, primarily blood loss from the lacerations, manner of death accidental. The park's enclosure and fencing get reviewed afterward and are found to meet standard safety requirements for that type of exhibit, which puts the responsibility for what happened squarely on Kevin, having crossed the barrier in the first place. His phone was recovered from the ground near where he'd climbed over, still recording a video he'd started right before going in, the last few seconds showing the moment the bear noticed him. The case closes within a matter of weeks. No changes to the enclosure or the fence height were recommended, since the barrier had done exactly what it was designed to do, which was keep people out, not stop them from climbing over it. It was July 19th, 2016, and the late afternoon sky above Hopi Point displayed the ominous characteristics of an approaching monsoon storm. Dark cumulonimbus clouds towered to heights exceeding 40,000 feet, their anvil-shaped tops spreading across the western horizon. The temperature had dropped from 89 degrees to 72 degrees within 30 minutes, while lightning flickered intermittently within the cloud formations, accompanied by distant rumbles of thunder. Evan Hearn, a 28-year-old warehouse loader from Phoenix, had driven up alone for an impromptu evening hike along the South Rim Trail system. Known among co-workers for his stubborn independence and tendency to dismiss safety warnings, Evan had a history of pushing through adverse conditions during outdoor activities. He had arrived wearing standard hiking clothes and tennis shoes, carrying only a water bottle and his cell phone. The National Weather Service had issued severe thunderstorm warnings for the entire Grand Canyon region, with specific advisories about lightning dangers on exposed rim areas. Posted signs at trailheads warned visitors to seek immediate shelter when thunder was audible. But Evan had dismissed these precautions as overly cautious. He believed his familiarity with Arizona weather patterns made him capable of judging the actual risk level. Hopi Point offered one of the most exposed overlooks along the South Rim, jutting out into the canyon with minimal natural shelter. The rocky promontory consisted primarily of Kaibab limestone formations, with scattered pinyon pine and juniper trees. The elevation of 7,071 feet made the location particularly susceptible to lightning strikes during electrical storms. As Evan walked along the exposed rim trail, the storm system continued its rapid approach from the southwest. Lightning strikes became increasingly frequent, with thunder following at intervals of less than 10 seconds, indicating the electrical activity was within 2 miles of his position. Other hikers had already retreated to their vehicles or sought shelter, leaving Evan essentially alone on the exposed overlook. The atmospheric conditions created an ideal environment for cloud-to-ground lightning strikes. The elevated terrain, combined with Evan's position as the highest conductive object in the immediate area, significantly increased his risk of being struck. The approaching storm cell generated powerful electrical charges, seeking the path of least resistance to ground. A massive lightning bolt discharged from the storm cloud directly overhead, following the natural electrical gradient toward the highest available conductor. The primary strike hit a limestone outcropping approximately 15 feet from where Evan was standing, delivering an estimated 30,000 amperes of electrical current to the rocky surface. The electrical energy created a side flash that arced through the air to Evan's body, entering through his left shoulder and exiting through his feet. The massive electrical current disrupted his cardiac rhythm instantly, causing immediate cardiac arrest. The strike also created distinctive burn patterns on his upper back and shoulder, while the electrical shock threw him backward onto a flat limestone ledge. Other visitors who had taken shelter in the parking area witnessed the lightning strike and immediately called emergency services. Park rangers responded from the South Rim station, reaching Hopi Point within 10 minutes. They found Evan unresponsive on the rocky ledge, with obvious signs of lightning strike injuries, including characteristic burn patterns and electrical entry wounds. Despite immediate CPR attempts and the use of an automated external defibrillator, rangers were unable to restore cardiac function. Evan was pronounced dead at the scene, with the official cause of death listed as cardiac arrest due to lightning strike. The subsequent investigation confirmed that the victim had ignored multiple weather warnings and remained in an exposed area during active electrical storm conditions. Rangers documented the lightning strike pattern and burn evidence, noting that the victim's elevated position on the exposed promontory had created optimal conditions for a side flash from the nearby strike. It was September 28, 2018, along the western coast of Sulawesi, where Palu Bay had become a growing destination for international tourists, drawn by its calm waters and affordable beachfront resorts. The resort sat less than 300 feet from the shoreline. Open-air lobbies, glass-panel ocean views, beachfront restaurants. It was designed to put guests as close to the water as possible. Dean Foster was 38 years old, working a physical maintenance role for a shipping operation back in Arizona. His wife Mary was 35, working at a local care facility. Their 22-year-old son Daniel joined them on what was supposed to be a straightforward family beach vacation, somewhere people specifically traveled to because it felt safe and well managed. There's something particularly hard about this case that I want to be upfront about, because what happened to the Foster family wasn't recklessness in the way we usually talk about on this channel. They were caught inside a moment where information broke down faster than anyone could process it before they ever had a clear chance to make the right call. The earthquake struck that afternoon, strong enough to knock drinks off tables throughout the resort. Staff received fragmented emergency radio messages suggesting possible tsunami activity, but details were unclear and changing minute to minute. The outdoor warning systems never broadcast clear evacuation instructions to guests. Workers near the front desk were overheard trying to confirm whether transport vehicles heading uphill were actually coming. No organized evacuation reached the guests still eating dinner in the beachfront restaurant. Then the ocean pulled back, not gradually, suddenly. Hundreds of feet of exposed wet sand where open water had been minutes before. Daniel walked out across the seafloor, pulling out his phone to record it. Dean followed with his own camera, drawn by something that looked unlike anything he'd seen before. Mary stayed closer to the resort entrance. Witnesses who survived stated she repeatedly urged both of them back as the situation around them started to feel uncertain rather than clearly directed. Some staff were moving inland. Others were still trying to guide guests, and from the outside, it wasn't obvious what the correct response was supposed to be. Dean kept filming. At first, I thought Dean followed Daniel to stop him. What I didn't expect was that instead of holding him back, he joined in, ignoring Mary as she tried to stop them both. Witnesses described a deep, low roaring from beyond the bay entrance. Not a visible wave, but a sound that arrived before anything could be seen. The surge hit the resort's glass beachfront panels with enough force to launch tables, luggage carts, and shattered glass across the entire lobby floor. Dean was struck by debris near the entrance and knocked against a concrete support column as floodwater exploded through the ground floor. Witnesses later found him pinned beneath collapsed wall sections near the restaurant side of the lobby. Investigators concluded he died from traumatic injuries sustained during the initial impact. Daniel disappeared beneath dark, churning water filled with broken furniture and debris. Mary reached the reception counter and attempted pulling him upward through the current when a second surge pushed through a side corridor and swept both of them deeper into the flooded hallway. Survivors on upper floors described the ground level filling completely within minutes. Mary was found beneath collapsed railings near a partially destroyed staircase corridor. Daniel's body was recovered farther inland the following morning. I can't even imagine what Mary was thinking in that moment, fighting the current, reaching for Daniel, and then being swept under herself. If you were in her place, watching someone you love disappear beneath that surge, what would you do? Emergency crews reached the property after debris was cleared from surrounding access roads. Dean and Mary were identified that evening. Investigators confirmed the outdoor tsunami warning system did not deliver a clear, audible alert across the resort during the critical window, and that staff communication during those moments was fragmented and overwhelmed by the speed of events. Authorities concluded all 3 deaths resulted from traumatic injuries and drowning during the surge, with the rapidly developing situation leaving little time for coordinated evacuation to reach everyone. It was August 12, 2017. Devgar was a small town in northern India known for a historic suspension bridge spanning the Kesha River. While the bridge attracted visitors passing through the area, it was usually quiet enough that people could pause to admire the view without feeling crowded. Eva Hoffman was 32 years old and worked as a veterinary nurse in Munich, Germany. She had traveled to India with 3 close friends for a 2-week holiday, spending their final weekend exploring smaller towns away from the country's larger cities. After browsing the local markets and eating lunch at a riverside cafe, they made their way toward the suspension bridge. Like many visitors that afternoon, they wanted to enjoy the view before driving back to their hotel. After all, nobody likes ending a good day early. The bridge stretched across the river high above the water, gently swaying beneath each passing step. Only a handful of people were on the bridge that afternoon. A few stopped to take photos while others leaned against the railings, looking out over the river before continuing on. Eva and her friends passed a local family walking in the opposite direction before slowing near the middle of the span. Without warning, a sharp metallic snap echoed across the river. The bridge suddenly sagged beneath everyone's feet as the wooden walkway groaned and the suspension cables strained overhead. Someone yelled for everyone to run, but before anyone had the chance to move, the center span suddenly gave way. The timber walkway split apart as the remaining supports failed one after another, folding sections of the bridge into the river below. Steel railings tore free, while shattered planks and broken cables crashed into the water, sending waves racing through the narrow channel. Eva was thrown directly into the river beneath the collapsing bridge. Before she could even orient herself, another section of the span slammed into the water nearby, forcing her deep beneath the surface. The river churned as the bridge collapsed above her, filling the water with broken timber, twisted steel, and crashing waves. Even after the last section settled into the river, debris drifted downstream. There was no sign of Eva as the current carried her away, leaving rescuers with no safe way to reach her before she disappeared beneath the surface. By the time rescue boats reached the area where Eva had entered the water, the current had already carried broken sections of the bridge downstream. Crews searched beneath the collapsed span, along the riverbanks, and farther downstream, uncertain whether she had become caught in the wreckage or been swept away by the current. Her 3 friends survived the collapse and were treated at a nearby hospital before later giving statements to investigators. Local police officers were the first emergency personnel to arrive, followed shortly afterward by firefighters and disaster response teams. Fishermen and tour boat operators joined the search, while divers checked beneath the collapsed bridge and rescue boats searched farther downstream. Eva's friends remained on the riverbank throughout the afternoon, hoping each returning boat would bring news that she had been found alive. It's one of those situations where everyone wishes they could do something to help. Instead, all they can really do is wait and hope for some good news. As the hours passed with no sign of Eva, rescue efforts officially became a recovery operation. The search continued into the evening as crews worked methodically along both banks of the river. Late that evening, rescue teams recovered Eva's body downstream from the bridge. A post-mortem examination determined that her cause of death was drowning. The official investigation concluded that years of neglected maintenance had allowed key structural connections to deteriorate. The initial failure shifted the bridge's weight onto the remaining supports, causing the center span to collapse. Several other people were treated for injuries sustained during the collapse, while Eva was the only fatality. The bridge remained closed while engineers assessed the damage before it was later demolished and replaced with a new crossing built to modern safety standards. Maybe that's what makes Eva's story so difficult to think about. She wasn't taking a risk or doing anything unusual. She was simply enjoying the last afternoon of her trip. It was October 11, 2016, at Grand Canyon National Park's South Rim in Arizona. As evening approached, tourists gathered at the overlooks while rangers monitored the trails under clear skies. But right in the middle of that crowd were 28-year-old Gail Robinson and 31-year-old Brian Green. Gail ran a small travel channel focused on outdoor spots. He edited videos for local businesses just to get by, and personally, I can totally relate to this. He spent nearly every spare dollar trying to make his channel blow up. His friend said he was energetic, ambitious, and always hunting for unique footage. Then you had Brian, who was chasing the exact same dream. He was a freelance photographer whose online growth had been painfully slow. If you've ever tried to build something online, you know how soul-crushing that can be. And for me, it's easy to see how he fell into a bad headspace. Brian was constantly tracking other creators' numbers, and over time, he'd actually developed this quiet, bitter social media rivalry with Gail. They were always trying to prove who could make the better content. That night, both of them ended up at a travel media meetup right around the main overlook. As sunset got closer, Gail started complaining that everyone was capturing the exact same boring footage. Brian agreed, but what frustrates me is that they immediately started debating who could find the most extreme angle before the sun went down. Now, just a short distance away, there were several warning signs advising people to stay on the marked trails because the ground near the rim is incredibly unstable. But neither Gail nor Brian paid attention. Personally, I think they had total tunnel vision. They were completely fixated on getting their shots. Pretty soon, they walked away from the crowd and stepped onto an unofficial rocky ledge way past the safety area. Other tourists noticed them getting way too close to the edge, and one person even yelled out a warning. But you know how ego works. Witnesses said both men just laughed it off and kept recording. Neither one wanted to back down and lose this unspoken competition. As the sun dipped lower, Gail started filming a wide-angle shot while walking backward, his eyes glued to his camera screen. Brian was standing just a few feet away, totally wrapped up in his own footage. When I think about this moment, it honestly makes my stomach turn. Neither man was looking at the actual ground. Without warning, Gail stepped onto loose gravel right at the edge. His feet shot out from under him, and his body went backward. Tourists heard him scream as he started sliding toward the drop. Brian lunged forward and managed to grab Gail's forearm right before he went over. For a few agonizing seconds, Brian actually held onto him. Witnesses described a violent, terrifying struggle as loose stones kept breaking free. Gail's weight pulled Brian closer and closer to the edge. Brian tried to brace himself. The ground shifted again, and both men slid forward together. It's hard for me to even imagine the horror of the crowd as they watched both of them disappear over the rim in an instant, because darkness and the steep terrain made a nighttime recovery too dangerous. Rescue teams secured the area and waited until first light to descend. Recovery teams reached the area the next morning. Investigators later recovered the cameras, and the footage showed both men focused on their screens rather than the ground around them. The medical examiner found that both died within minutes from massive blunt force injuries caused by the fall. What stays with me is that the cameras captured exactly how it happened. For a few seconds, their attention shifted from the cliff to getting the perfect shot. It was October 17th, 2016. At 7:41 p.m., the Shibuya pedestrian scramble in Tokyo cycled under light rain. Crosswalk lines reflected red and green signals across wet asphalt. Umbrellas moved in every direction. Traffic waited at all approaches as the pedestrian phase counted down. Among the crowd was Ethan Caldwell, 27, a tourist from Portland visiting Japan for the first time. He worked in IT support and had saved for the trip for nearly 2 years. His social media page was filled with travel photos. The Shibuya crossing was at the top of his list. He wanted the classic center of the intersection shot with crowds moving around him and neon lights behind. He carried only his smartphone and a short, handheld grip. He had seen others stand still in the middle of the scramble while everyone flowed around them. The crossing allows pedestrians roughly 2 minutes before vehicle signals turn green in all directions. When the green walking signal begins flashing, pedestrians are expected to clear the roadway before it turns red. As the pedestrian light turned green, Ethan crossed with the crowd from one corner. Instead of continuing to the opposite curb, he stopped near the center, about 15 feet from the nearest edge. He turned his back toward the largest video screens and held the phone slightly above eye level for a wide shot. People brushed past him. Several pedestrians gestured toward the countdown display overhead. He repositioned, stepping backward a few feet to keep the densest crowd in frame. The green walking signal began flashing. The crowd thinned rapidly as people cleared the roadway. Ethan remained in place, adjusting his stance for another shot. The pedestrian phase ended. Vehicle signals turned green in all directions. From the westbound lane, a city bus began accelerating into the intersection at approximately 20 miles per hour. Ethan, slightly crouched and looking down at his phone screen, stood low in the roadway as headlights reflected off the wet pavement. Witnesses reported a short horn blast. Ethan looked up and attempted to step forward. The bus closed the final distance in less than 2 seconds. The right front corner of the bumper struck his left shoulder and the side of his head. The impact spun him sideways and dropped him directly in front of the right front wheel. He fell onto his back, partially beneath the bus's front axle. The right front tire rolled over his upper abdomen and lower chest before the driver fully braked. The bus stopped within several feet. Witnesses reported hearing the impact as the bus rolled to a stop. Ethan lay motionless on the roadway. There was little external bleeding. Within minutes, his abdomen began to swell from internal hemorrhage. Multiple bystanders called emergency services immediately, while others signaled vehicles to stop. First responders arrived in approximately 6 minutes. Ethan had no pulse and was not breathing. CPR was initiated on the asphalt. Advanced life support measures were attempted. No cardiac activity returned. He was pronounced dead at 7:51 p.m. Cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the torso, with rapid internal blood loss after the bus tire crushed his abdomen, rupturing the liver and spleen. Rib fractures and lung contusions were documented. Toxicology was negative. Investigators reviewed traffic signal timing and vehicle speed, both within legal limits. They concluded that a person positioned low in the roadway can fall into a forward blind area of a large bus, especially at night with reflections on wet pavement. The driver was cleared of wrongdoing. The death was ruled accidental, with the victim's presence in an active traffic lane cited as the primary contributing factor. His phone was recovered from the crosswalk a few feet away. The intersection reopened after the investigation and resumed normal flow within hours. It was January 14, 2017, on the Big Island of Hawaii. Kilauea had been in continuous eruption since 1983, and by early 2017, the lava flow from the East Rift Zone had been reaching the ocean at the Kamokuna entry point along the southern coastline. That site had become something of an attraction, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. The problem was that the area around it was cordoned off for a reason, and that reason was not bureaucratic overcaution. Yael Solvik was 36, a documentary photographer from Amsterdam. She'd spent years building a portfolio around natural phenomena, volcanoes, storm systems, coastal events. She had permits, published work, real experience in difficult environments. I'll give her that. But here's the thing. And this is important. None of that changes what she actually did on the morning of January 14th. Because what she did wasn't a professional judgment call. It wasn't a calculated risk based on experience. It was walking past a clearly marked exclusion zone onto a piece of ground that the USGS had flagged as actively unstable because she wanted a better photo. That's it. Strip away the credentials, and that's the whole story. She'd been on the Big Island for 4 days, shooting the lava flow from approved viewing areas each morning. And look, the approved shots were good. Steam rising off the water, the glow of the flow visible even in daylight. Dramatic sky. Most photographers working that coastline that week were more than satisfied with what the approved areas gave them. Yael wasn't. Each morning she'd been inching closer to the exclusion zone boundary, shooting from as near the rope barriers as she could get. By day 4, that apparently still wasn't close enough, so she crossed. No. The morning of January 14th, she made her way to the Kamakuna entry point before the area was staffed for the day, which, if you think about it, tells you something about how deliberate this was. She didn't accidentally wander past the barriers. She showed up early specifically to avoid the staff who would have stopped her. The exclusion zone was marked with signage and rope barriers. She stepped over them and walked out onto the bench itself. She didn't just step past the barrier and stop. She moved out across the bench surface, past the rope line, past the signage, a meaningful distance from the shore, and set up to shoot. A crew member aboard a Coast Guard patrol vessel operating near the coastline observed her out there, repositioning for different angles, spending several minutes on the bench, which means at no point during any of that did anything prompt her to stop and reconsider. She was focused on the shot. The bench looked flat, dark, walkable from above. It always does. That's the entire reason the exclusion zone existed. Here's what a lava bench actually is, because it matters. It's not solid ground. It's a thin shelf of brittle-cooled basalt suspended over open ocean, formed as successive lava flows cool and solidify over the water. Underneath, it's being weakened constantly. Thermal stress from the active lava flowing below, wave action eroding it from the ocean side. Volcanic monitoring authorities had been observing the Kamakuna bench in the days before January 14th and had flagged it as actively unstable. The exclusion zone had been extended that week specifically because of how the bench was behaving. All of that information was the reason the barriers were where they were that morning. She walked past them anyway. Shortly after the Coast Guard crew members spotted her, a section of the bench gave way beneath her without warning. She went into the water at the active lava entry point, an area generating a continuous plume of laze, a toxic mix of hydrochloric acid gas, steam, and fine glass particles produced when molten lava contacts seawater. Laze can cause rapid respiratory distress at close range. The Coast Guard vessel moved toward the site immediately, but conditions at the entry point made close approach extremely dangerous. Yael Solvik was recovered from the water by the Coast Guard crew after they were able to safely approach the area. She was unresponsive. She was pronounced dead after being brought to shore. Cause of death was confirmed as respiratory failure due to laze exposure, combined with injuries consistent with the bench collapse. She was 36 and had been on the Big Island for 4 days. The case was closed as an accidental death with no evidence of foul play. Her camera equipment was recovered from the bench site. Most of it was destroyed. It was May 6, 2018, near Hermit Trailhead, where temperatures reached 91 degrees despite posted heat advisories. The group continued along exposed rocky trails under still desert air as afternoon heat intensified across the canyon walls. Vaughn Trite, a 37-year-old delivery driver from Flagstaff, had joined 2 co-workers for an afternoon hike along one of the lesser-used trails in the area. Known for his brash personality and tendency to show off for social media, Vaughn constantly documented his outdoor adventures with photos and videos. His colleagues had grown accustomed to his attention-seeking behavior, though they often expressed concern about his willingness to take unnecessary risks. After hiking for approximately 2 hours, they encountered a western diamondback rattlesnake coiled beside sandstone rocks near the trail. The 4-foot snake had positioned itself in the shade between the boulders, seeking relief from the intense heat. Its distinctive diamond-patterned markings were clearly visible, identifying it as one of the region's most medically significant species. Vaughn immediately pulled out his phone and began filming from about 8 feet away. The reptile remained motionless in its defensive coil, displaying typical defensive behavior. His companions urged him to maintain distance and continue along the trail, recognizing the inherent danger. Ignoring their warnings, Vaughn stepped closer, reducing the distance to approximately 5 feet while continuing to record. He retrieved a lightweight aluminum trekking pole from his backpack and began prodding the rocks near the snake's position attempting to provoke movement for more dramatic footage. The snake's rattle buzzed in warning, but the continued harassment triggered its natural strike response. Vaughn had positioned himself directly in front of the reptile, well within strike range, which typically extends to approximately 2/3 of the snake's body length. The rattlesnake struck with lightning speed, its fangs penetrating Vaughn's lower left leg just above the ankle, delivering a significant dose of hemotoxic venom directly into his tissue and bloodstream. As Vaughn jerked backward in shock and pain, a second defensive strike hit his right calf. Both strikes resulted in confirmed envenomation, compounding the venom load in a body already compromised by dehydration and exertion in extreme heat. Severe pain radiated from both bite sites, followed by rapid swelling and visible discoloration that spread within minutes. Blood oozed from the puncture wounds as the venom began breaking down blood cells and tissue, while also affecting his cardiovascular system. Vaughn's companions immediately called emergency services using their cell phones, providing GPS coordinates from their hiking app. They attempted to keep him calm and still, knowing an increased heart rate would accelerate venom circulation through his bloodstream. Within 20 minutes of the bites, Vaughn developed severe pain, rapidly expanding swelling around both legs, dizziness, nausea, and early signs of circulatory instability. Became increasingly disoriented as the venom spread through his bloodstream. Tissue damage was visible at both bite sites, with rapidly expanding swelling and deepening discoloration spreading outward. Emergency services dispatched a helicopter from Flagstaff Medical Center, but the remote location delayed their arrival. The helicopter reached the scene approximately 35 minutes after the initial call, landing in a cleared area about 200 yards from the bite location. Paramedics found Vaughn unconscious with severe swelling in both legs and obvious signs of systemic envenomation. Despite immediate stabilization and rapid transport, his condition continued to deteriorate. At the hospital, he was given anti-venom and intensive supportive care, but developed uncontrollable internal bleeding and cardiovascular collapse. He was pronounced dead several hours after arrival at the medical facility. The official cause of death was cardiovascular collapse secondary to severe hemotoxic envenomation and hypovolemic shock. The subsequent investigation revealed the victim had deliberately provoked the snake while filming, directly contributing to the fatal encounter. It was May 6, 2018, in Florence, Italy. During a warm peak tourist afternoon, the cathedral plaza was packed, and Giotto's Campanile, a 277-foot bell tower clad in white, green, and pink marble, drew crowds climbing its narrow staircase to reach panoramic views of the city. Olivia Hart was 26 years old. She worked in a creative role at a design studio back in Chicago, the kind of work that trains your eye to notice composition, framing, and light in a way most people don't. She'd spent 2 weeks traveling across Italy specifically to document historic architecture for a photography page she'd been building online. Florence was one of the stops she'd planned most carefully, and the tower was on the list. The problem was the crowds. By the time Olivia reached the upper observation platforms, every angle overlooking the city had someone standing in it. Groups clustered against the railings, phones raised, selfies, tour guides talking loudly in multiple languages. For someone trying to capture clean architectural footage without tourists filling the frame, it was genuinely frustrating. Being a photo enthusiast myself, I get the frustration when you've traveled all that way for a shot and every angle is blocked. But there's a big difference between adjusting for a better view and crossing into something that turns dangerous. Security footage later showed Olivia near a partially open maintenance door on one of the upper levels, while staff was occupied assisting a tourist farther down the staircase. The door led into a narrow stone corridor connecting to the upper bell chamber, a section used by maintenance crews to service lighting and mechanical systems, clearly marked in both Italian and English as restricted. Olivia slipped through the doorway, carrying a camera stabilizer and a small backpack, while nearby tourists continued upward toward the observation deck, completely unaware. Inside the maintenance corridor, the lighting dropped significantly compared to the public staircase. The stone steps leading toward the bell chamber were steep and worn smooth from centuries of use. Olivia climbed toward the upper section where several enormous suspended bells hung inside thick wooden support frames high above the city. The open stone arches framing the bells looked directly out over the Florence skyline, exactly the kind of unobstructed, crowd-free angle she'd been looking for. Staff later confirmed that tourists were strictly prohibited from entering the bell chamber, specifically because the bells generated powerful swinging force within a very confined space, and scheduled ringing periods were not communicated to the public in advance. Witnesses inside the tower reported hearing the cathedral bells begin ringing shortly after Olivia entered the restricted section. Investigators believed she had moved close to one of the active bells while attempting to film the swinging mechanism with the skyline visible behind it. To get that shot, she stepped past the safer perimeter of the chamber and into the bell's swing clearance, positioning herself just inside the arc of motion so the moving bell would pass through her frame. In that position, she was only a few feet from the bell's path, leaving almost no margin for error once it began to move. I keep asking myself, is it really worth risking your life for just one photo? Still disoriented from the strike, she stumbled backward toward the edge of the archway opening while trying to regain her footing. The stone surface near the arch was worn and uneven. Witnesses in the cathedral plaza below reported seeing movement near one of the upper tower openings, moments before screaming began both inside the stairwell and outside in the plaza. Olivia fell through the exposed exterior arch and dropped toward the cathedral grounds below. Her camera stabilizer and phone struck lower rooftop sections of the structure separately before landing. Tourists in the plaza scattered in panic. Emergency responders sealed off portions of the surrounding plaza, while investigators examined the upper bell chamber and the maintenance corridor she had entered. Cathedral staff evacuated remaining tourists from the staircase and closed the tower immediately. Security footage confirmed Olivia had passed through the maintenance doorway minutes before the scheduled bell ringing began. Investigators concluded she died from catastrophic blunt force trauma sustained during the fall onto the stone pavement below. Officials reviewed maintenance access procedures and security surrounding the bell chamber entrance following the incident. The partially open maintenance door through which she entered was flagged in the investigation as a contributing factor. It was September 9th, 2017. The Kinabatangan River winds through dense rainforest in eastern Malaysia, its muddy banks lined with thick vegetation and overhanging branches. The area is known for its wildlife, and guided river trips often bring visitors close to animals that remain hidden in other parts of the jungle. Michael Hines was 38 years old and worked as an airline mechanic in the United States. He was traveling through Malaysia on holiday and had joined a small guided excursion along the river to see wildlife in its natural habitat. He had spent the earlier part of his trip moving between different parts of the region, and this was one of the stops he had been looking forward to. The group spent the afternoon moving slowly along the river, watching for movement in the trees and along the banks. Monkeys crossed through the canopy and birds flew low over the water. The boat stopped whenever something caught the guide's attention, allowing everyone to get a better look. After a while, the river itself simply became part of the background. Later in the day, the boat idled along a quieter section near the bank. The guide pointed out tracks in the mud and signs of recent animal activity near the water. Crocodiles were known to live throughout the river, but the dark water made them almost impossible to see until they were very close. Michael shifted toward the side of the boat and looked down. The water appeared still, broken only by small ripples moving away from the bank. The attack happened at close range. A large crocodile surged from the water beside the boat and closed its jaws around Michael's lower body. The force pulled him sideways before he could regain his balance. He struck the edge of the boat as the animal dragged him over and into the river. Other passengers lunged forward, but his position near the side and the crocodile's strength left them with nothing they could hold. Michael disappeared beneath the muddy surface. The guide cut the engine and moved the boat away from the bank while scanning the water. For several seconds, there was no movement. Then Michael resurfaced farther downstream. He reached toward a low branch hanging over the river as the guide turned the boat back toward him. Several passengers moved to the side, ready to grab him once they came close enough. The boat moved closer as Michael reached for a low branch. Before he could grab it, the crocodile caught him again and pulled pulled him under. Emergency calls were made, while nearby boats began searching the surrounding water. Crews watched the riverbanks and moved slowly downstream, hoping Michael might surface a second time. Instead, they began noticing another disturbance. A long wake repeatedly appeared behind the search boats before disappearing beneath the muddy water. Whenever a vessel changed direction, the movement seemed to shift with it. At one point, Crocodile surfaced farther downstream with part of Michael's clothing still visible between its jaws. It disappeared again before anyone could approach safely. Its continued presence forced the smaller boats to keep their distance. The search continued from farther away while crews tracked movement along both sides of the river. What makes this so difficult is that the danger never left the scene. It stayed close enough to control how the search unfolded. Several hours later, the animal moved farther downstream. Michael's body was recovered after it was released near a muddy section of the bank. A post-mortem examination determined that he had died from drowning, with severe injuries from the attack contributing to his death. Investigators reviewed the boat's position, the location of the stop, and accounts from the passengers. The incident was recorded as an accidental death caused by a wildlife attack. During a later search of the shoreline, teams found several old personal items near a concealed area beneath the bank. Investigators could not determine how long they had been there or whether they were connected to the crocodile. No unsolved missing person cases in the area could be definitively linked to the discovery, and the item's origin remained unknown. Although there was no evidence the crocodile had attacked anyone before Michael, the unexplained discovery left investigators with more questions than answers. Wildlife teams searched the surrounding stretch of river for the crocodile. Tour operators also strengthened rules requiring passengers to remain seated and keep away from the edges of boats in known crocodile territory. A guided tour can feel more controlled than it really is. Sometimes having a guide nearby just makes us lower our guard. It was August 18, 2021. A gray afternoon hung over the coastal mudflats near Olympic National Park in Washington. The tide was far out, exposing wide stretches of wet sand and mud. Small groups of visitors walked the shoreline, while seabirds moved across the flat. The weather seemed calm and ordinary. Out beyond that safe shoreline, 32-year-old John James Keller was walking around. Now, from what I gathered about James, he had spent pretty much his entire adult life trying to stay one step ahead of his younger brother, Roran. James was a fiercely competitive sales manager, and personally, I'd just call him stubborn. Roran, a videographer, had that same competitive streak. Their family gatherings usually turned into these harmless little contests that neither brother ever wanted to lose. Well, that afternoon, the brothers were exploring a remote tidal area notorious for dangerous mudflats. Warning signs were posted everywhere explaining that the deep mud could trap you and that the incoming tides had actually killed people, but the brothers just blew off the warning. And this is where things took a turn that personally makes my stomach drop. Their little debate turned into a dare. Both of them stepped right past the warning signs and started walking across the mudflats, filming it on their phones. At first, the ground felt totally solid. They were laughing and pushing farther out. About 15 minutes later, James dropped knee-deep into the muck. Roran just laughed and started recording. James tried to yank his leg free, but as I'm sure you can picture, that only drove his other leg even deeper. Within minutes, the mud swallowed him past his thighs. Bystanders begged them to call 911. Personally, it looks like neither brother wanted to swallow their pride and admit this was a real emergency. For nearly an hour, Roran tried everything, yanking James's arms and digging with his bare hands, but honestly, it was completely useless. The mud created a terrifying suction, holding tighter the more they struggled. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and I can only imagine the panic setting in as the tide was slowly creeping back. A tourist finally called for help. Responders were sent immediately, but reaching them took forever because James was trapped several hundred yards from solid ground. And thinking about how much time was wasted before that call was finally made is ridiculous. By the time rescue crews arrived, shallow water was already pooling around James. Rescuers carefully deployed specialized mud rescue equipment, including inflatable paths and safety lines to avoid becoming trapped themselves. Once they reached him, rescuers secured harnesses around his upper body and attempted to free his legs using water jets and rescue tools designed to break the suction around buried limbs. But the mud extended far deeper than anyone initially realized. Every attempt to free him took precious time, and the incoming tide kept rising. I've heard about the body camera footage from that night, and honestly, it sounds like a living nightmare. It shows rescuers working continuously for more than an hour, while the water rises from around James's knees to his waist and eventually to his chest. The situation fell apart fast. The incoming seawater made it impossible to keep digging, and James was freezing and exhausted. Soon, the rescuers faced a terrifying reality. They were about to get trapped and drown themselves. Supervisors had to make the brutal call and order the crew to retreat. James stayed stuck as the ocean completely covered him. Recovery teams found James's body later that night. What stands out in the investigation is the timeline. Nearly an hour passed between the moment he became trapped and the moment anyone called for help. Investigators concluded that an earlier emergency call would likely have given rescuers enough time to reach him before conditions became fatal. The death was ruled accidental. Following the incident, park officials renewed warnings about reporting emergencies immediately, even when people believe they can solve the problem themselves. The case was later referenced in visitor safety materials as an example of how delaying a rescue request can quickly turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. It's devastating to think about. A delay driven largely by pride and embarrassment ended up costing James his life. It was September 3rd, 2015. In Barangay San Roque, on the outskirts of Tarlac City, steady late-afternoon rain swept across open rice fields and low houses. Thunder rolled at short intervals. Streetlights flickered as wind pushed sheets of water sideways. An unfinished four-story concrete structure rose bare above the flat neighborhood. On that road stood Jerome "Jem" Alonzo, 24. He worked as a delivery helper for a small appliance store in town, lifting refrigerators and washing machines into tight stairwells for modest pay. He lived with his older sister and helped with utilities. Online, he posted frequently, short clips of daily life, weather changes, and dramatic skies over the rice fields. Severe storms often drew strong engagement, and he had filmed lightning from ground level before. That afternoon, the storm intensified quickly. Local weather bulletins reported frequent cloud-to-ground lightning across central Luzon. Instead of heading straight home, Jerome ran into the unfinished building, later telling a neighbor he wanted a clearer view above the rooftops. The structure had open stairwells, no guardrails, and exposed steel rebar extending from the roof columns. Two bystanders waiting under a roadside shed saw him enter and begin climbing. He was wearing rubber sandals, shorts, and a soaked t-shirt. In his hand was a metal telescoping selfie stick extended to about 8 feet with his phone mounted at the end. Thunder cracked immediately after a bright strike nearby around 5:23 p.m. One driver waved and signaled for him to come down. Jerome continued upward. He reached the rooftop slab, stepped near the edge, and turned toward the storm clouds over the open fields. The roof was wet. Vertical steel bars protruded from the corners, connected to the concrete frame. Jerome raised the metal stick above his head, angling the phone back toward himself with the storm behind him. He stood roughly 45 feet above ground, surrounded by exposed steel. Seconds later, a cloud-to-ground lightning bolt struck the building. Witnesses described a blinding white flash that lit the entire structure. The thunder followed instantly, sharp and concussive. The lightning struck the building, and the electrical discharge traveled through the reinforced concrete and exposed steel. Jerome, holding a metal stick above the roofline, became part of that conductive path. The current entered through his right hand and lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was sufficient to disrupt the heart's electrical rhythm. His body stiffened from sudden muscle contraction. Witnesses saw him snap backward. He lost footing on the slick concrete and fell from the roof edge. He struck the ground head first on compacted soil beside the building. The impact was immediate and violent. Blood pooled beneath his head. His body lay twisted, motionless. Bystanders reached him within seconds and called emergency services at approximately 5:27 p.m. Several people checked for breathing and pulse, but found none. An ambulance arrived about 12 minutes later. He remained unresponsive and pulseless. The medico-legal examination determined the cause of death was the combined effects of a lightning strike and blunt force trauma sustained in the fall. Injuries included a depressed skull fracture, severe brain hemorrhage, multiple cervical spine fractures, and rib fractures that punctured both lungs. The head and neck injuries were catastrophic. A deep electrical burn was documented on the right palm, with a smaller exit wound near the left foot, consistent with current traveling through the body to ground. Both eardrums were ruptured from the concussive shock of the strike. His phone was recovered near the base of the building and showed visible damage consistent with exposure to the electrical surge. Authorities classified the incident as accidental during a thunderstorm. Local officials later worked with the property owner to secure the unfinished structure, sealing entry points and blocking access to the stairwell. In the days that followed, the building remained closed, marked by temporary fencing and caution tape as it stood above the surrounding rice fields. It was October 8, 2016. Autumn had settled over Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado, and the annual elk rut had brought visitors from all over the country. Pullouts along the park roads filled throughout the day as people stopped to watch the massive bulls roaming the open meadows. Todd Marcus Wheeler was 38 years old and had driven to the park with his wife for a weekend getaway through Colorado. He enjoyed photographing wildlife whenever they traveled, although most of his experience came from local parks and nature preserves rather than large national parks. That afternoon had already been a memorable one. They had spotted mule deer, bighorn sheep, and now the elk everyone seemed to be stopping for. During the fall rut, bull elk are extremely territorial. They can appear completely relaxed one moment and charge the next with very little warning. If park staff receive reports of an injured or entangled animal, trained personnel handle the situation. Visitors are instructed to keep their distance even when it looks like the animal needs help. I can understand why someone would want to help. The problem is, the rule doesn't stop applying just because you're trying to do something good. About a dozen people stood along the roadside watching the elk through binoculars and camera lenses. Every few minutes, another vehicle pulled over after noticing the small crowd. The bull barely acknowledged them, continuing to graze while occasionally lifting its head toward the road before lowering it again. Eventually, someone noticed what looked like a length of plastic cord tangled around one of the elk's antlers. Every so often, the bull shook its head, sending the loose cord swinging through the air. Several people commented that they felt bad for the animal. Todd quietly watched for several minutes before saying it looked like something that could be cut away in just a few seconds. Someone nearby replied that it was probably better to notify park staff, but Todd wasn't convinced anyone would arrive before the elk wandered off. He pulled a small multi-tool from his backpack and started walking into the meadow while everyone else stayed near the road. At first, nothing happened. The elk continued grazing, only occasionally looking up as Todd slowly closed the distance. He stopped more than once, giving the animal time to react, but it simply lowered its head and resumed feeding. His wife called out for him to come back, but Todd told her he was almost there. I've noticed people naturally get a little closer when an animal doesn't seem bothered by them. It's easy to mistake tolerance for trust. By the time Todd was only a few feet away, he had already unfolded the small blade on the multi-tool. He slowly reached toward the tangled antler. The elk instantly lowered its head and charged. Todd spun around and tried to run, but he had barely taken 2 steps before the elk slammed into him from behind. The impact threw him to the ground. The bull wheeled around and struck him again before trampling him as he tried to curl into a protective position. Witnesses shouted from the roadside but stayed back because the elk remained agitated and continued pacing around him for several moments. Eventually, the bull turned and ran deeper into the meadow. Todd's wife called for help while several bystanders directed responders to the exact location. Medical personnel reached the scene a short time later, but Todd had suffered catastrophic injuries to his chest and abdomen. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators found no evidence that the elk had behaved unusually or been provoked beyond Todd's close approach. They concluded the attack was a defensive response by a wild bull during the rut, and his death was ruled accidental. The elk was not euthanized because it had reacted naturally to someone entering its space. Park officials later reminded visitors that even when an animal appears calm or seems to need help, the safest choice is to keep their distance and notify park staff instead. Good intentions don't mean much to a wild animal that thinks it's about to be grabbed. It was June 27, 2016, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The temperature hovered around 85 degrees, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of juniper and pine across the rocky terrain. Tourists moved along the well-worn paths, cameras clicking as they captured the vast expanse of layered rock formations stretching toward the horizon. Dixie Gable, a 41-year-old administrative assistant from Phoenix, had driven up with 3 co-workers for a day trip. Known for her infectious laugh and tendency to document every moment of her adventures, Dixie had already filled her phone with dozens of photos since arriving that morning. She wore comfortable walking sandals and a bright blue tank top, her shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The group had spent most of the day following the main rim trail, but as the afternoon wore on, they ventured toward a quieter plateau overlook, set back about 30 feet from the main canyon edge. The area featured scattered sandstone slabs and weathered boulders, creating natural seating areas where visitors could rest and take in the panoramic views without the crowds. Dixie spotted what she considered the perfect backdrop, a clear view of the canyon's layered walls with the Colorado River visible as a thin ribbon far below. She handed her water bottle to one of her companions and pulled out her phone, stepping backward to frame the shot properly. The plateau's surface was uneven, with loose sandstone fragments and small rocks scattered across the weathered bedrock. Her co-workers noticed the unstable footing and called out warnings about the rocky terrain. The area had several fractured sandstone slabs that appeared solid, but rested loosely on the underlying rock surface. Dixie continued adjusting her position, focused on getting the canyon's dramatic depth in the background of her selfie. The late afternoon lighting created perfect conditions for photography, with golden hour approaching and shadows adding dramatic contrast to the canyon walls. As she took another step backward, her left foot landed on what appeared to be a stable sandstone slab about 2 feet wide. The loose rock shifted suddenly under her weight, throwing off her balance. She stumbled, trying to regain her footing, but her right foot caught the edge of a small boulder embedded in the plateau surface. The combination of the tilting slab and the obstacle sent her tumbling forward. She fell approximately 15 feet down a steep rocky slope below the plateau. Her head struck a sharp sandstone outcropping with devastating force during the initial impact, followed by her body hitting several more jagged rock formations on the way down. The trauma to her head and torso was catastrophic. Her companions immediately called for help using the emergency number posted at nearby trail markers. Park rangers responded from the South Rim station, reaching the scene in approximately 12 minutes. They found Dixie unresponsive at the bottom of the rocky slope, her phone lying shattered several feet away. Despite immediate medical attention, Dixie was pronounced dead at the scene. The subsequent investigation determined that the official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and torso sustained during the fall, with the fatal injury occurring when her head struck a sandstone outcropping below the overlook. Rangers concluded that she had been attempting to take a photograph while walking backward across unstable terrain, which directly led to the loss of balance. The incident report cited loose, fractured sandstone, scattered rocks, and uneven footing as contributing factors, along with her footwear choice. Park officials later referenced the case in internal safety briefings, reinforcing long-standing guidelines, warning visitors to remain stationary and alert when taking photographs near canyon edges and rocky plateau overlook. It was April 25, 2015. Kathmandu, Nepal, was one of the country's biggest tourist destinations, known for its centuries-old temples, busy markets, and historic neighborhoods. Many of those older districts were filled with brick buildings that had stood for generations, although a large number had never been built to withstand a powerful earthquake. Natalie Crawford was 34 years old and worked as a museum curator in Manchester, England. She had always loved visiting historic places, which was exactly why Nepal had been on her travel list for years. She planned to spend 2 weeks exploring the country, beginning with a few days in Kathmandu before heading toward the mountains. Friends later said she had been counting down the days until the trip. If you love history, Kathmandu is the kind of place where hours can disappear before you know it. On the morning of April 25th, Natalie spent several hours exploring temples, courtyards, and local markets before stopping for lunch at a small family-run cafe inside an older 2-story building. The cafe was fairly quiet. Natalie ordered a meal, looked through the photographs on her camera, and sent a few of them to her parents back home. A few minutes later, glasses behind the counter began to rattle. The first shock was enough to send dishes rattling across the shelves. People were already getting out of their seats when a deafening crack echoed through the building. Tables lurched across the floor as sections of the walls began splitting apart. Customers rushed toward the entrance, but before most of them could reach the door, one side of the building gave way. The upper floor collapsed into the dining area. The shaking continued for several more terrifying seconds. Outside, people struggled to keep their footing as bricks, roof tiles, and shattered glass crashed into the surrounding streets. More buildings along the block shed debris, while power lines swayed overhead. Inside the cafe, Natalie remained trapped beneath the rubble as more dust and broken masonry rained down around her. When the strongest shaking finally eased, several customers had managed to escape through the entrance, but others, including Natalie, remained buried beneath the rubble. Nearby shopkeepers, residents, and passers-by cautiously made their way back toward the rubble. While some began pulling away loose bricks with their hands, others called emergency services and guided rescuers to the scene. Sometime later, rescuers heard a woman calling for help from beneath part of the collapsed roof. It was Natalie. She was pinned beneath a large wooden support beam that had trapped her lower body. Unfortunately, the same beam was also supporting part of the collapsed upper floor. Removing it too early could have caused even more debris to fall. Rescuers carefully cleared rubble around Natalie while looking for a safe way to lift the beam without bringing more of the structure down. Natalie remained conscious for several hours. As rescuers worked around the rubble, they spoke to her regularly to make sure she stayed responsive. She told them her name, asked if somebody could contact her family, and wanted to know if they could get her out. The earthquake, however, was followed by a series of aftershocks. Every time it happened, rescuers had to pull back while loose bricks and broken timber shifted overhead. Once the shaking stopped, they returned and continued clearing debris. It was the harsh reality of earthquake rescues. Saving a trapped survivor sometimes meant waiting until it was safe enough to continue. Late that afternoon, another powerful aftershock struck. Part of the remaining structure collapsed into the space where Natalie had been trapped. When rescuers reached her again, she was no longer responding. Once engineers determined the remaining structure was stable enough, heavy lifting equipment was brought in to remove the fallen beam. Natalie's body was recovered later that evening. A post-mortem examination determined she had died from crushing injuries caused by the secondary collapse. Engineers later concluded the earthquake caused the cafe to collapse, while the building's age and previous structural alterations likely reduced its ability to withstand the intense shaking. It was demolished during reconstruction efforts, and a new building was later constructed on the site using updated seismic standards. There is something especially cruel about disasters like this. Nobody wakes up expecting that day to be their last. It was October 3, 2017, at a public high school football stadium in Tucson, Arizona. The Friday night game had ended less than an hour earlier. Most of the crowd had left. Stadium lights remained on for cleanup crews, and the backside of the bleachers was quiet and largely unwatched. Mateo Fuentes was 19 and a college freshman. He lived with his parents and older sister in southeast Tucson. His father worked in HVAC installation, and his mother worked part-time at a grocery store. Mateo had about 190 Instagram followers and had posted only a handful of times that year. He had no large audience and no school involvement. He attended the game with 3 young men. During the second half, one of them pointed out the press box roof above the home bleachers and joked about the clear overhead view of the field. After the game ended and the crowd thinned, Mateo fixated on the idea. He told 2 of them he was going to climb up for a quick selfie with the stadium lights and empty field behind him, saying it would look like he had the whole place to himself. The third had already left. Around 10:20 p.m., cleanup crews focused on the main seating sections. The service corridor behind the home bleachers was not meant for spectators. A chain-link gate at the base of the exterior stairwell had a bent lower corner, leaving a gap wide enough to squeeze through. Mateo slipped inside, while his 2 friends remained on the service road below. He climbed the exterior metal staircase to the press box landing. The booth door was locked. A fixed steel ladder extended about 12 feet from the landing to the flat roof above. There was no cage around the ladder. He climbed up. The roof was flat and covered with a rubber membrane. Along the front edge facing the field was a concrete parapet about 14 inches high. It was not designed to prevent falls. Stadium lights illuminated the field, casting long shadows across the seating deck below. From the ground, his friends saw him move toward the front edge. They later told officers he stood near the parapet briefly, then stepped onto the low wall and straddled it while holding his phone out in front of him. The wall provided minimal footing. Witnesses said he leaned backward to widen the frame, extending his arm and shifting his weight away from the roof surface. His center of gravity moved beyond the narrow wall. His heels slipped on the membrane. He tipped backward. He fell approximately 35 feet from the roof edge to the upper concrete seating deck below. The drop was unobstructed. He struck the left side of his body first, followed by the back of his head against the concrete. The impact was heard by his friends below. They ran toward the bleachers and called 911 immediately. Mateo lay motionless on the concrete and showed no purposeful movement. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. He was unresponsive with severe head and left side injuries and abnormal or absent breathing. He was transported for advanced care, but was pronounced dead later that night. The autopsy determined the primary impact involved the left side of his body, resulting in multiple rib fractures with bleeding into the chest cavity, a collapsed lung, a ruptured spleen, and a severely fractured left upper arm. Head injuries included a skull fracture and a right-sided subdural hematoma. The official cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury due to a fall from height. Police ruled the death accidental. No foul play was suspected. In the weeks that followed, the damaged gate was replaced with a solid barrier, and the ladder to the press box roof was fitted with a locked cage to prevent unauthorized access. Mateo's phone was recovered near his body. Investigators confirmed he had been attempting a selfie from the parapet. No image from that night was uploaded. It was July 14, 2019, inside a privately operated geothermal cave near Hveragerði, Iceland. Small guided groups visited the cave to see its naturally heated mineral pools and unusual rock formations. The tunnels were warm and narrow, and that morning, the tour began under normal conditions. Jennifer Bannister was 41 years old and worked as a travel photographer. She loved visiting places that most travelers never experienced, but she had very little experience inside geothermal caves. She joined the tour hoping to photograph the colorful rock walls and steaming pools for a future travel collection. Before entering, everyone received helmets and listened to a safety briefing explaining the evacuation route and why nobody should leave the group because several tunnels connected underground. Earlier that week, workers noticed slightly stronger steam in one chamber, but inspections found nothing serious enough to close the cave. Minor earthquakes had also been recorded across the region, something common in Iceland, and temperature checks remained within safe limits before visitors entered. The group followed the guide through the underground passages, stopping at several pools along the way. Jennifer occasionally paused to take photographs before catching up again. Many of the tunnels looked alike, making it easy to lose your sense of direction without someone leading the way. I'll admit, Jennifer reminds me of a lot of travelers I've seen. When you finally reach a place you've dreamed about, it's easy to spend a few extra moments looking through a camera instead of noticing how quickly things around you can change. A slight vibration passed beneath the cave. Most visitors barely noticed it. Deep below one section of the tunnel, however, the movement opened a new crack connected to underground hot water. Pressurized steam quickly forced its way into nearby passages. Within moments, thick steam spread through the tunnels, hiding both the passage ahead and the junction behind the group. The guide immediately led everyone toward the entrance while counting people. A second head count near the exit showed Jennifer was missing. At one intersection, Jennifer could no longer see the tunnel markers through the dense steam. Believing the exit was still ahead, she entered a staff service passage connected to the tour route. Instead of leading outside, it carried her farther underground. Every breath filled her nose, mouth, and throat with extremely hot steam. The intense heat quickly burned the inside of her airway. Almost immediately, the exposed skin on her face and hands was also burned. As the injuries worsened, swelling inside her throat made each breath harder than the last. The heat also damaged her eyes, leaving her unable to find her way back. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but the affected passage remained too hot to enter safely. Protective clothing alone could not withstand the temperatures inside. Rescue teams monitored the underground heat and waited until conditions became survivable before beginning their search. I actually respect the restraint the rescuers showed here. Waiting must have felt unbearable, but rushing inside would have placed even more people in the same danger Jennifer was already facing. By the time crews safely reached the service passage, Jennifer had already died. The medical examination found catastrophic inhalation burns. Her airway was not completely blocked at first, but severe swelling caused by breathing the superheated steam eventually prevented enough air from reaching her lungs. Specialized rescue personnel later recovered her body once conditions inside the affected passage became safe enough for entry. Geological investigators determined that a minor seismic movement created a new fracture beneath the tunnel, opening a path for pressurized geothermal steam that did not exist before the tour began. They also found no evidence that earlier inspections electricians could have detected the newly formed vent. The attraction later added automatic heat alarms, expanded underground monitoring, and revised its evacuation procedures. Other geothermal tour operators also reviewed their emergency plans after studying the accident. What surprises me most is how ordinary Jennifer's plans were that morning. She expected to leave with photographs, but the cave itself changed into something nobody there had prepared to face. It was August 14th, 2016, deep in Brazil's Amazon basin, where brown river water cut through dense jungle during the dry season. A wooden lodge stood roughly 20 feet above the muddy riverbank, surrounded by thick tree cover. The water level during August was unusually low, and that matters because low water means one thing out here. Fish concentrate in smaller pools, competition for food intensifies, and anything that moves near the surface becomes a target. Anyone living near that river already knew this. Zamira Thorne was 27 years old. She worked behind the counter at a small print shop back in Oregon. By most accounts, she was adventurous, outgoing, and driven by a genuine desire to experience things outside her routine. She'd spent close to a year saving for a solo backpacking trip through South America. She wanted something real, something worth talking about when she got home. What she also wanted was content, the kind of footage that makes people stop scrolling. She'd spent the evening filming short clips with two backpackers she'd just met, chasing what she called fearless travel moments. I get it, I really do. The urge to prove you were part of something incredible is really something you can be proud of. But being fearless isn't the same as being reckless. Earlier that afternoon, fishermen upstream had dumped animal scraps into the river. Lodge workers knew immediately what that meant. They spent most of the day warning tourists to stay out of the water, not casually, but repeatedly and specifically. The signs were hard to miss. Violence splashing near the dock, stripped fish carcasses drifting through the reeds, birds circling low overhead. A guide warned Zamira directly not to go near the ladder because piranhas were gathering during the feeding window. Rope barriers were tied across the lower platform entrance. The issue here is that the warning sign was laid out clearly. It just wasn't enough to stop Zamira, who had already made up her mind. A tourist nearby began throwing fish chunks into the river to attract dolphins, and a crowd gathered along the railing with phones out. Zamira removed her sandals, stepped around the rope barrier, and climbed down the dock ladder while staff yelled for her to stop. She was waist-deep in roughly 4 feet of murky brown water, holding her action camera above her head when the bites began. Witnesses described sudden splashing near the ladder moments after the scraps hit the surface about 10 feet away. The strikes across her ankles and calves came fast, not the cinematic swarm from movies, but scattered rapid bites that caused immediate pain. She tried climbing back up. Her foot slipped against algae-covered wood below the waterline. Her shin struck a lower support, and she dropped sideways into deeper water. The fall appeared to briefly disorient her. What followed was a desperate struggle to regain footing in water she could barely see through while bites continued across her legs and feet. Every time she slipped lower, her hands went under and the fish struck at her fingers. A lodge worker used a hooked pole to drag her closer, while another beat the water with an oar to scatter the fish. She pulled herself halfway up the ladder before her injured leg gave out, and she went back under. Witnesses stated her panicked thrashing made everything significantly worse. Staff eventually got her onto the platform using the pole, and a towel looped around her arm. Her lower legs were covered in dozens of bite wounds, most shallow and irregular, not the catastrophic injuries people might imagine. She was coughing up river water, drifting in and out of consciousness, breathing becoming increasingly shallow. The nearest medical station was only accessible by boat. Responders arrived nearly 40 minutes later. Investigators concluded Zamira died from a mix of drowning, head trauma from the fall, blood loss, and spending too long in the water. The bites were not considered the main cause. Authorities questioned the tourist who threw fish scraps into the river, though no major charges were announced. In the days after the incident, workers installed wooden barriers to block river access. Zamira's body was transported by canoe to a nearby town the next morning. It was October 19, 2016. The Whitsunday Islands lie off the tropical coast of Queensland, Australia, where clear blue water, white sand beaches, and coral reefs attract visitors from around the world. It's one of the country's most popular destinations for sightseeing and boating. Stephen Cooper was 43 years old and worked as a civil engineer in England. He was visiting Australia on a 2-week holiday and had booked a full-day sightseeing trip through the Whitsunday Islands. After several days exploring the Queensland Queensland coast, he decided to spend one day out on the water. He had chosen the excursion for the opportunity to visit beaches and reefs that could only be reached by boat. I can't really talk about the Whitsundays without mentioning the boat rides. That's where some of the best views are. The morning unfolded exactly as planned. The group visited a reef, spent time on one of the beaches, and continued through the island channels under clear skies. Visibility stretched for miles, and the water remained smooth enough for boats to travel comfortably at speed. As the afternoon wore on, traffic on the water became heavier. Tour boats passed sailing yachts, private speedboats crossed between islands, and smaller fishing boats moved through the same channels. In open water, there usually seemed to be plenty of room, but vessels approaching from opposite directions could close the distance surprisingly quickly. Most passengers had settled back into their seats for the trip home, expecting a quiet ride across the open water. Stephen's boat had begun its return journey when another speedboat appeared ahead, traveling through the same channel from the opposite direction. At first, there was no obvious sign of danger. Both boats maintained their speed while the gap between them steadily narrowed. Only during the final moments did it become clear that they were on converging paths. Both operators reacted almost simultaneously, each attempting a last-second turn to avoid the other. Instead of opening enough space, the two maneuvers kept the boats on intersecting courses. There was no time left. The bow of the approaching speedboat slammed into the side of Stephen's vessel with tremendous force. Fiberglass shattered across the water as the impact shoved the sightseeing boat sideways. Seats ripped loose, equipment scattered across the deck, and several passengers were thrown violently from where they had been sitting. The force of the collision threw Stephen from his seat into one of the boat's metal support frames before he collapsed between two rows of seats. Other passengers struck railings or the deck, while one person was thrown into the water wearing a life jacket. The second speedboat also sustained heavy damage, though its passengers escaped with less serious injuries. Both boats drifted to a stop only a short distance apart. Passengers who could still move immediately began helping the injured, while emergency calls were made by mobile phone and marine radio. Nearby boaters reached the scene within minutes, rescuing the passenger from the water before assisting the injured on both boats. Stephen had suffered severe head injuries and extensive internal bleeding. Passengers did what they could to keep him still while waiting for trained responders, but there was little medical equipment available aboard either vessel. Emergency crews traveled across open water from the mainland and nearby islands. Despite their efforts after arriving at the scene, Stephen's injuries proved fatal before he could be transported for further treatment. Several other passengers from both boats were treated for broken bones, cuts, bruises, and other injuries. Everyone else survived. Investigators later examined the damaged boats, GPS data, radio communications, passenger photographs, and witness statements. The evidence showed that both vessels had remained on converging courses until the final seconds. Although both operators attempted to avoid the collision, the late maneuvers left too little distance for either boat to clear the other. Stephen Cooper died from multiple blunt force injuries, with internal bleeding identified as a major contributing factor. His death was ruled accidental. Investigators also found that neither poor weather nor limited visibility had contributed to the collision. Both boats had been traveling through calm water on a clear afternoon. One thing I've learned is that we think of roads as dangerous, but busy waterways have their own blind spots and traffic conflicts. It was September 1st, 2012, in Zion National Park, Utah. Hikers moved through the visitor area collecting maps and water, while park staff monitored forecasts for thunderstorms expected later that day. Among those hikers was 38-year-old Sebastian Avery. 38-year-old Sebastian Avery was a tech sales manager known for finding the absolute fastest route to everything, whether it was a work project or a hiking trail. Personally, I think we all know someone just like that. He and his wife Emily were on vacation in Zion National Park. Emily usually planned their trips and checked the weather, but Sebastian relied almost entirely on technology. He trusted navigation apps with his life. Honestly, it's a habit a lot of us are guilty of. That morning, a park ranger told them a popular slot canyon route was closed due to expected thunderstorms. But to me, it's so frustrating to see what Sebastian did next. He checked his phone, saw the app still listed the route as open, and assumed the ranger's info was just outdated. They kept hiking and passed a physical closure sign. Sebastian stepped right around it. Farther down the trail, they hit another warning sign about flash floods. If I were Emily, I would have been losing my mind here, and she did beg him to turn back. But Sebastian pointed to his screen, arguing that thousands of people trust this app every day. By afternoon, the canyon walls narrowed and thunder echoed nearby. Because the sky directly overhead was still clear, Sebastian assumed the warnings were exaggerated. In my opinion, he just used this to validate his own bias. They pushed deeper inside. Shortly after 3 o'clock, a thin stream on the canyon floor instantly turned into a rushing torrent of thick, muddy water, rocks, and debris. They managed to scramble onto a narrow ledge a few feet up. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been, just trapped there while the flood roared right below them. They stayed on the ledge for nearly 2 hours while floodwater rushed through the canyon. Eventually, the current slowed, and much of the canyon floor became visible again. Emily wanted to wait for help, but Sebastian believed the danger had passed. After climbing down, they carefully continued through the canyon. Minutes later, Sebastian slipped on mud-covered sandstone, falling hard and breaking his leg while suffering a head injury. It is very disturbing to think he was completely immobilized. Emily tried calling 911 but had no signal. As daylight faded, she moved between Sebastian and a higher rock shelf, searching for a way out, but he couldn't climb. Hours later, a second flood surge roared into the canyon. Emily scrambled back onto the elevated shelf, but Sebastian could barely move. Because of his injuries, he was overtaken by the water. Emily survived the night and was rescued the next morning. Rescuers found Sebastian's body downstream. The medical examiner confirmed he drowned after being trapped by the second flood. When I look at the park's investigation, the facts are incredibly clear. The canyon was closed the day before, warnings were posted everywhere, and rangers were on high alert. What really stays with me is what the investigators stated at the end. If they had just stayed on that ledge and waited, both would have lived.